Plan on landing and having a little chat with the rat. I'm gonna find out what he knows about our cruise, whether he likes it or not.
I see. And what would you have me do while you're out pretending to be Errol Flynn? Just sit here and guard the Zeppelin?
That's right. And let's get this straight, sister. Errol Flynn pretends to be me, not the other way around. Laugh it up, gorgeous. I'll see you when I get back.
Crimson Skies is an alternate history arcade flight sim, co-developed by Zipper Interactive and Microsoft and released in September 2000. The game is set in a balkanized diesel-punk version of 1930s America, where treasure-laden airships crowd the skies and propeller-powered privateers prey upon their precious cargo. In Crimson Skies campaign, players take on the role of gentleman pirate Nathan Zachary, captain of the Pandora and leader of the Fortune Hunters. Zachary and his merry band soar across the disunited states in search of booty and high adventure, tangling with skyborn lawmen, rival gangs, and more than a few of Zachary's old flames. But in the midst of the chaos, Zachary espies other forces at work in America, shadowy figures with designs on land, wealth, and most of all, the life of Nathan Zachary himself. Crimson Skies was promoted as a game that would put the fun back in flight, aimed squarely at mainstream and casual action gamers who could fulfill the fantasy of being a daredevil pilot in the golden age of aviation. The game was marketed with the tagline, "Big guns, fast planes, and gorgeous dames," positioning itself in opposition to the staid and sexless world of traditional flight sims. Crimson Skies thus provided a story-driven single-player campaign, the ability to design and customize aircraft, fly both preset and custom instant action scenarios, and spar with other players online. Officially, Crimson Skies was an adaptation of Fassa Corp's 1998 tabletop game of the same name, which modelled aerial combat between quasi-historical warplanes and prioritised accessibility, action, and strategy. Several of the key figures involved in the making of Crimson Skies had also worked on the original board game, though the core development team was constituted by MechWarrior 3 developers Zipper Interactive. Crimson Skies was launched as the centerpiece of a transmedia marketing blitz that included tie-in novels, a planned comic book series, a clothing line, and more. As an official Microsoft release, and headlined by tabletop gaming legend Jordan Wiseman, expectations for the title were high. Crimson Skies received mostly positive reviews when it was released in September 2000, with praise for its action, setting, and style, but mixed impressions of the controls and criticism of severe bugs and performance issues. Next Generation magazine gave Crimson Skies a perfect score of 5 stars, praising it as fun, fantastic, and different, and perhaps the greatest pirate-themed game since Sid Meier stepped onto the scene. The review's only criticism was that the game's engine was occasionally being pushed past its limits, and in a backhanded compliment, in saying it was a flight sim designed for people who hate flight sims. Computer Gaming World rated Crimson Skies 4 stars out of 5, with Charles R. Dye calling it ridiculously zany, rewarding, and the best tribute to classic action serials he had ever played. R. Dye was less complimentary towards the music and voice acting, which he said could become grating, as well as long loading times and issues with stutter. PC Powerplay also thought the game was just a hair short of perfection, giving Crimson Skies 89%. Reviewer Des McNicholas felt it was a fun, fast-paced, intense, innovative, and atmospheric experience that was undermined by frustrating performance issues, crashes, and general bugginess. PC Zone awarded Crimson Skies 82% and their Seal of Excellence award, calling it a gloriously indulgent dogfighting fantasy that was well served by its role-playing roots and glam retro aesthetic. However, the review also complained that the game was too short, too shallow, and too easy, suggesting Crimson Skies was something of a lightweight in comparison to the recently released Star Lancer. One of the most negative reviews came from Edge magazine, who gave the game 5 out of 10. Edge complained that poor performance, long loading times, and infuriatingly bad friendly AI encouraged a cautious and timid playstyle, sabotaging Zipper's fantasies of daring, adrenaline-fueled action. International reviews leaned mostly towards the positive, with Argentina's Extreme PC giving Crimson Skies 94% and commending it as a real feast for the senses. The review argued that minor quibbles like 2D vegetation, performance issues, and cardboard cutout NPC models couldn't detract from the game's filmic charm, and characterized Crimson Skies as a cinematic, addictive, and exciting action experience that had become the new benchmark for arcade flight sims. France's Joystick were a close second in enthusiasm, bestowing upon the game a princely 90% for its rich and unique universe, style, supercharged engine, addictive gameplay, and accessibility. Joystick did warn of a serious save game bug and somewhat beefy hardware requirements, but remarked that it was impossible not to fall in love with Crimson Skies, recommending readers get their hands on the game and its tie-in materials as soon as possible. Poland's Reset were also very positive, giving Crimson Skies 85% and crediting the game for its story and presentation, variety of mission types, and controls, though recommended making use of a flight stick rather than the mouse and keyboard. Reset were less pleased by the loading times, which they felt dispelled the game's atmosphere, and of the aforementioned save game bug, which nearly caused the reviewer to snap his CD in two. Finally, Germany's PC Joker were moderate in their praise of Crimson Skies, being mostly impressed by its graphics, music, and instant action mode, and giving it 81% overall. The magazine's main complaints were of the game's unwieldy controls, which they felt necessitated investing in a joystick, and of the audio mixing, lack of subtitles, and issues with the localization. Crimson Skies would be followed up by an arcade port in 2002 and a semi-sequel, High Road to Revenge, released in 2003 for the original Xbox. The brand was later bolstered by updates to the board game, a collectible miniatures game, and further tie-in material. As of 2023, the Crimson Skies franchise is considered dormant, though interest has been shown by both Microsoft and Jordan Weisman in resuscitating the series. Unlike the 2003 Xbox game, the original Crimson Skies is not at the time of writing available on digital distribution platforms, nor has it been updated by Microsoft for compatibility with modern systems. In today's video, we'll take a trip back in time to learn about the conception and development of Crimson Skies, then have a look at the game itself, how it works as an arcade flight sim, its presentation and production values, and finally the game's story and setting. Feel free to take a look at the timestamps and find the part of the video that interests you, or keep watching to learn about the long road that brought arcade aerial action to our screens. So with all that said, let's go back to 1990 and begin our journey through the making of Crimson Skies. Game designer Jordan Weisman is typically cited as the inventor of the Crimson Skies franchise, though Weisman himself is also credited, among others, Dave McCoy, Vic Bonilla, and John Howard as key figures in its development. All of these men worked at tabletop gaming company FASA, originally founded by Weisman and Ross Babcock in 1980. By the early 90s, FASA had a number of major achievements to its name, such as the sci-fi wargame BattleTech, the cyberpunk fantasy RPG Shadowrun, and the vehicular combat sim MechWarrior, all of which went on to enjoy a number of highly successful video game adaptations. But one of FASA's most radical ventures was the founding of the company Environmental Simulations Project, later renamed to Virtual Worlds Entertainment. Virtual Worlds' mandate was to take the BattleTech universe, hitherto limited to rulebooks, tie-in novels, and artistic representations, and bring it to life as a fully simulated virtual reality experience. This was to be achieved by encasing players in BattleTech pods that were modelled on the interiors of the iconic battle mechs of said universe. The first of these commercial BattleTech centers debuted in Chicago in 1990, and over the course of the next few years, other venues were opened in cities across America and Japan. But FASA and Virtual Worlds saw potential for the BattleTech centers beyond a mecha sim. The most well-known offshoot of the BattleMech pods was the Red Planet simulation, which allowed players to participate in a Martian death race, but many other concepts were considered. One such idea was for a virtual reality aerial combat experience, prompting Jordan Weisman to begin researching the early years of aviation as part of creating the background lore for the game. The deeper Weisman delved into the history of flight, in particular the pre-World War II era of dogfights and daring aces, the more invested he became. The game's premise involved a virtual geographic league with a 30s explorer aesthetic, counting famous aviators like Howard Hughes and Amelia Earhart among its ranks. According to a later interview with GameSpot UK, development progressed far enough that a prototype for the simulation was built, but by this point Virtual Worlds were facing financial difficulties and the project was temporarily put on hold. 2 years of gathering dust later, it was clear that Weisman's virtual reality dogfighting simulation was not happening, but his passion for the original idea remained strong. Weisman founded FASA Interactive Studios in 1994, which was intended as a platform for developing PC games based off various FASA and Virtual Worlds properties, the most obvious candidate being the BattleTech universe. But one of the earliest projects to enter development at the studio was a continuation of the aerial action idea that was conceived at Virtual Worlds. Combat flight simulators had seen some success on both home computer and consoles, with one title credited by Weisman as a major influence being LucasArts' Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe. Released in 1991, Secret Weapons was a more fantastical, arcade-style flight sim than its rivals, featuring experimental aircraft and prototype weapons from the final years of World War II, with the actual mechanics of flying a plane simplified for the sake of fun. It was the excitement of being a dogfighting ace, rather than the minutiae of fiddling with cockpit controls that attracted Weisman. Thus, in 1994, Weisman and fellow BattleTech alumni Dave McCoy began development on an arcade aerial combat game for PC. Eventually going by the working title of Corsairs, the game was initially to be set during the interwar period in a fictional island chain off the coast of Europe, with a focus on aerial duels between what Weisman described as Knights of the Air. But like the VR sim, the project never made it off the ground. In most interviews, no reason for this is given. In a later GameSpy interview, for example, it's merely stated that the idea was shelved. But in an August 2000 Q&A with IGN, Weisman let slip that development had been stalled due to the release of another title with a very similar conceit. Although Weisman did not name said title, the game in question may have been 1995's Air Power: Battle for the Skies, developed by flight sim studio Rowan Software. Taking place in the fictitious European kingdom of Caranthia, Air Power is set during a succession crisis that pits 4 rival duchies against each other, with bandits and a hostile neighbour thrown into the mix. Each claimant conducts their campaign from a heavily armed zeppelin, supported by a fleet of airships and World War II-inspired fighter planes. Players leap into their cockpit and engage in aerial duels, strafing runs, escort missions, and raids on enemy fleets. Though the similarities to FASA's Corsairs were likely coincidence, and conclusive proof of a relationship is absent, Air Power does bear a remarkable resemblance to Weisman and McCoy's vision. Indeed, many years later, Joystick magazine would joke that the concept for Crimson Skies had obviously been stolen from Rowan Software. Despite the setback, Weisman was, in his own words, still desperate for the opportunity to bring FASA's vision to life. A solution was proposed by Virtual Worlds' J.M. Albertson, who suggested simply moving the setting to America. There are differing accounts of the exact sequence of events that followed, but at some point the decision was made to translate the concept behind Corsairs into a board game. By this stage, Weisman and McCoy were devising the universe that we would today recognise as Crimson Skies. Weisman has stated that the central fantasy of the series was no longer Knights of the Sky, but that of pirates and pilots. As Weisman saw it, the image of Errol Flynn with a knife between his teeth, climbing into the coolest looking fighter plane ever built. Weisman needed a setting in which widespread air piracy would be plausible, and thus looked to the conditions that gave rise to the 16th century buccaneers that reaved and raided their way across the Caribbean. This would inspire the linchpin of the Crimson Skies universe, a balkanized and politically tumultuous US, where interstate transportation networks had fallen apart, thus leading to the rise of the airship. In this scenario, sky pirates could raid shipping lanes before fleeing back to stolen zeppelins or hideouts in the lawless borderlands, or obtain sponsorship and protection from rival states. With aerial duels untainted by radar, guided missiles and advanced anti-air weapons, combat remained the domain of individual aces, who earned celebrity status as the iconic heroes and villains of their age. This core now in place, FASA began fleshing out the background lore, themes and aesthetics that would define the world of Crimson Skies. John Howard, who joined FASA as webmaster and worked his way up to the design team, would later characterize Crimson Skies as the personification of what it meant to be cool in 1930s America, an era he called the last truly romantic period in American history. Radio serials, swing music, Howard Hughes and Hollywood's golden age, celebrity aviators, pin-up girls and experimental Wunderwaffen were but a tiny selection of the influences cited by Howard. Of course, there had to be a game beneath all this, and FASA began developing the rule set for a character-based dogfighting and dive-bombing board game. Originally, the Crimson Skies board game was not being developed as a formal FASA project. At the time, FASA Corp were working on various other projects, and prior to 1997, FASA Interactive staff were juggling multiple MechWarrior, BattleTech and Shadowrun titles. Those involved, Weisman, McCoy, artist Vic Bonilla and many others, were working on Crimson Skies during lunch breaks or after business hours, but there was considerable passion for the game, and the team grew to include many senior employees, all the way up to FASA Corp co-founder Ross Babcock. Though character-driven and meant to encourage role-playing, Crimson Skies was purposefully not designed as a tabletop role-playing game, as it was meant to feature fast, furious and accessible action. And according to both Weisman and Howard, it was also never meant to be an end in itself. When Crimson Skies was debuted at Gen Con 1998, FASA explicitly told the press that if the board game were a success, then development on the Crimson Skies PC game could resume, and in later interviews the designers restated that the entire purpose of the board game was to promote the cause of Weisman and McCoy's postponed aerial combat game. The board game launch also confirmed an oft-repeated aphorism of FASA employees, which was that they didn't create individual products, but universes or fantasies. Crimson Skies' December 1998 release was accompanied by a wealth of tie-in material, such as the in-universe Air Action Weekly and Atlas World News, or short stories written by authors like Michael Stackpole, who at the time was well known for his BattleTech and X-Wing novels. Most of these stories by Stackpole and others would later be formally published in the Spicy Air Tales anthologies. Earlier that year, FASA had bought out its partners in the Ralpatha Miniature Company, which produced the Crimson Skies models, and announced plans to expand its catalogue. FASA even partnered with aviation-themed fashion brand Avirex to produce official Crimson Skies flight jackets. Weisman stated that their intention was always to use all this as a springboard to resuming development on the Crimson Skies computer game. In fact, according to art director Heinz Schiller, FASA Interactive did manage to produce a working prototype build of Crimson Skies for home PCs, and pitched it to the rest of the company. But after an internal review by upper management, it was determined that the project was not a viable option for the company at that time. It was yet another in a long line of failed liftoffs for Crimson Skies, and a crushing disappointment to the team. But Jordan Weisman remained committed to the belief that one day, PC gamers would be able to hop into the cockpit of a J2 Fury and soar across an alternate America. And Weisman's dream came true, just not, strictly speaking, at FASA. Because in January 1999, Microsoft purchased FASA Interactive in an almost comically convoluted maneuver worthy of any ace pilot, involving multiple mergers and sales and resales and remergers and rebrandings. The final result was that Microsoft now owns several companies previously part of FASA Corporation, as well as exclusive and perpetual rights to various FASA properties, whilst FASA Interactive would be integrated into Microsoft games and eventually renamed FASA Studio. In press releases, FASA and Microsoft stated that their priority was to support the further development of the MechWarrior franchise, and to explore the possibility of future games utilizing the Shadowrun, Earthdawn, and Renegade Legion universes. But according to John Howard, Crimson Skies was one of the first projects that Weisman and the team pitched to their new owners. Howard admitted that the concept was an extremely difficult sell, as any game associated with dogfighting and aerial action was immediately branded with the proverbial scarlet letter of a flight simulator. Though Microsoft had its own line of flight sims, the genre was widely viewed as a niche market that appealed primarily to a very specific subset of enthusiasts. Many gaming magazines at the time did not review aerial combat titles as action games, but rather passed them on to specialist reviewers, whose columns were often buried towards the back of the review sections. Moreover, according to one source, the entire point of purchasing FASA had been to expand Microsoft's gaming division beyond sim-oriented studios. Dispelling the idea of Crimson Skies as a flight sim was thus critical to Weisman and Howard from the very start to the very end of the game's development. FASA cited older titles like Hellcats, Chuck Yeager's Air Combat, and Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe as proof that dogfighting games didn't have to be all about hyper-realistic physics and 600-page manuals. To both Microsoft and later to the press, Weisman and Howard characterized Crimson Skies not as a game that simulated flight, but rather that simulated the fantasy of being a fighter pilot. Microsoft greenlit the project, and finally, Crimson Skies was to become a reality. Just not a reality at FASA Interactive, because the core development team for Crimson Skies was to be a studio called Zipper. This Redmond-based studio had a prior relationship with FASA. In 1997, they had taken over development of the third game in the MechWarrior series. This was publicly attributed to FASA being impressed by the capabilities of Zipper's revolutionary 3D engine, though other sources claim the move had been forced upon them by then publishing partner Microprose. Whatever the truth, Microsoft assigned Zipper and their Game Z engine to the development of Crimson Skies. It was not Zipper's first outing with dogfighting games. They had released the poorly received Top Gun Hornet's Nest in 1998, which like Crimson Skies was meant to be a more mainstream action-oriented title than typical combat sims. But whilst Zipper were responsible for the, quote, nuts and bolts of Crimson Skies development, creative direction on the project was assigned to Jordan Weisman, John Howard, and Dave McCoy. This trio weren't the only FASA alumni returning to Crimson Skies, with Vic Manila, for example, also providing illustrations and aircraft design. And being a Microsoft product, there were also developers, support staff, and managers from other divisions involved. An early milestone for the Crimson Skies team was creating a prototype level to demonstrate the project's viability and future direction. The scenario chosen was an attack on a moored Zeppelin that would spectacularly burst into flames and plummet to the Earth, a scene obviously meant to evoke the Hindenburg disaster. The demonstration was a success, and the prototype would eventually find its way into the final game as one of the mid-game missions. Although agreement had been reached on the general direction of the game, further discussions took place regarding specific details of the game's multiplayer, customization options, instant action modes, and gameplay balance. In a later community chat on Microsoft's Game Zone, John Howard stated Zipper had originally hoped to allow players to import their own graphics for use in-game, as well as implement more mission types, such as strafing runs, but that these features were cut later in development. In another community interview, the team revealed that more multiplayer modes had been planned, but that these options were streamlined early on due to the game's focus on the single-player campaign. The campaign itself also went through some changes, such as scaling back the role of the player's Zeppelin. Initially, the player was able to fly back to the Pandora and use it to rearm and resupply, but this made the missions and different plane types difficult to balance and was removed. Early screenshots and trailers also depict planes, model designs, and enemy crews that were altered or did not appear in the final game. Some changes, such as the removal of a fame and fortune mechanic or a chapter set in the Grand Canyon, may have been made for practical or artistic reasons. But other cuts may have happened due to legal concerns. Several chapters of the campaign originally involved the participation of real-life historical figures, such as aviator Howard Hughes, actress Mary Pickford, and New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. In an internal design document, it was suggested that these should be run by Microsoft's legal department, and many of these characters would later be removed or relegated to background lore. Some coverage of the game also hinted at a more complex campaign structure and considerably more ambitious post-release support. One article stated that a series of downloadable single-player missions were potentially in the works. Another suggested that the game's multiplayer mode would receive something akin to the seasonal updates and live service model of modern titles, though these may be the result of journalists misinterpreting statements made during the game's marketing campaign. That campaign began when Crimson Skies was formally announced to the press towards the tail end of 1999, with a projected release date of summer 2000. Previews of the game remarked on both the novelty of the game's premise and the scarcity of arcade flight sims in the contemporary PC gaming market. Some magazines referenced early 90s titles like Luftwaffe or the various Red Baron games. Others pointed out that the subgenre was now primarily associated with X-Wings and starfighters. One or two multi-platform publications noted that the console market was still producing aerial combat sims, but almost none mentioned Zipper's previous attempt at a dogfighting game. Though there was broad enthusiasm for what had been shown of the title, one or two outlets nevertheless expressed concern as to whether the concept of a flight sim that was not a flight sim would be an easy one to market. But for Weissman and the team, distancing Crimson Skies from the sim label was an absolute priority. In an interview with Insight magazine, Weissman stated that Crimson Skies wasn't a flight sim at all, but a flight action game. In a PC XL feature, he insisted the campaign would be an action game right from the very first moment, with no pesky tutorials or instruction manuals to get in the way. And in a discussion with the Adrenaline Vault, Weissman called it a combination of X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, Interstate 76, and Half-Life. Similar sentiments were repeatedly expressed by John Howard and others in contact with the press. Thus, whilst the team promoted the semi-historical basis of the technology, culture, and notable personages of the Crimson Skies world, they steered clear of precise details regarding physics calculations, fidelity to real-life planes, or the technical specifications of the aircraft. As Howard put it in an IGN interview, simulators are about simulating the scientific reality of flight, followed by Howard yawning theatrically. Instead, the general tone of Microsoft's marketing campaign for Crimson Skies was shooting, sex, style, and swing, emphasizing fast-paced action, beautiful women, and period-appropriate production values. Most magazines were sympathetic to the team's concern that aerial combat had become synonymous with $300 flight sticks and instruction manuals worthy of a civil service exam. PCXL, for example, opened their preview by telling readers not to worry, because though Crimson Skies might look like a sim game, it wasn't, and ended the article by assuring them, "This ain't your pop's flight sim." There was a widespread perception that Crimson Skies being labelled a flight sim would be an albatross around the game's neck, and this was certainly borne out by press coverage constantly making disparaging comparisons to the genre as a whole. Computer Gaming World suggested that Crimson Skies was the shot in the arm that the wheezing sim genre needs, whilst Hyper Magazine observed that when Microsoft's own Combat Flight Simulator 2 debuted at trade shows, it was completely ignored by everyone except flight sim nuts. But not every commentator agreed that Zipper's attempts to distance themselves from more conventional combat sims was a formula for success. Computer Gaming World later observed that even arcade-oriented sims like Wing Commander or Free Space featured mechanics like power management or commanding wingmen. The magazine noted that this extra level of complexity did not appear to be present in Crimson Skies, leading Chris Lombardi to muse, "The designers are consciously bucking against entrenched conventions here. Will they buck too hard?" Zipper seemed to have been aware that marketing Crimson Skies as a simplified or streamlined form of flight sim had the potential to backfire on them. In an interview with PC Powerplay, John Howard took issue with magazines referring to Zipper as having toned down or scaled back the realism and mechanical complexity of flight sims, preferring to use terms like sweetened instead. But if Zipper, Howard, or Weissman had any misgivings about how Crimson Skies was being received in the gaming press, they were somewhat mollified by the knowledge that the game was being backed by the largest software company on the face of the earth. Microsoft's ability to promote the game with competitions, tie-ins with flight stick manufacturers, exclusive previews and cover stories, advertisements, and prime trade show spots was added to FASA's existing transmedia marketing campaign for the franchise. The Crimson Skies universe was expanded with several episodes of the Crimson Skies Action Theatre, an in-universe radio drama, along with more short stories and Air Action Weekly features, supplements to the original board game, as well as the promise of future Crimson Skies novels, a comic book series, a coffee table book, and the usual tie-in merchandise. But in a CGW interview, several anonymous members of the Crimson Skies team stated that the main advantage of being part of Microsoft wasn't so much a bigger budget, but rather being free of the pressures that working in a smaller developer entailed. Since the Crimson Skies team were not surviving game to game, they were able to take extra time to fix things and bring a troubled project back on track. As it turned out, that extra time would be needed, as Crimson Skies failed to hit its projected release date of summer 2000 and was rescheduled for a winter launch instead. At least two sources indicate that the game did not come together until very late in development. In the July 2000 entry of a developer diary sponsored by GameSpy, John Howard reveals that the project had just entered beta status, stating that prior to this, many features, including all the aircraft bar one, were still awaiting implementation. Similarly, according to CNET's Stephen Poole, a Microsoft representative stated that Crimson Sky's single-player, instant action, and multiplayer modes had not been tested together as part of the beta, resulting in the infamous launch bug that wiped the player's single-player progress. All the same, Microsoft were apparently confident enough that they provided beta access to the press prior to the game going gold. Though this garnered a generally positive response from gaming magazines, a smattering warned their readers that they were worried by the beta build's performance and stability. These more critical voices were vindicated when the game hit shelves, as bugs and bad frame rates were unquestionably the most common complaints voiced by reviewers. And they weren't the only naysayers whose concerns turned out to have some merit. Numerous reviewers, in particular CGW's Charles R. Dye, but echoed by many others, argued that Crimson Skies hadn't quite reached the sweet spot of balancing depth with accessibility, as the final product was too simplistic for flight sim enthusiasts, but too hardcore for regular players, an almost identical response to that received by Zipper's Top Gun a few years earlier. But though Top Gun had been poorly received and quickly faded into obscurity, Crimson Skies earned generally high scores and was soon being called a cult classic, endorsed by publications ranging from Reset to Rolling Stone. How much of a hit Crimson Skies was commercially is not entirely clear. In January 2001, CNET's Mark Asher stated that neither MechWarrior 4, Starlancer, nor Crimson Skies had done well for Microsoft. Conversely, a few months later, PC Powerplay would refer to Crimson Skies as a commercial success, with George Soropos implying that it might finally force flight sim developers to recognize the reality of market forces. Another article from 2003 backs up Mark Asher, stating that Crimson Skies had been less than successful. It was certainly popular enough to be re-released multiple times through the early to mid-2000s, and peripherals manufacturer Logitech continued using Crimson Skies to demo their new joysticks for several years after its original launch. Many of the FASA staff who had joined Microsoft to work on Crimson Skies would continue with the company for some time, with Jordan Weissman focusing on his role as creative director of Microsoft Games, whilst John Howard and Dave McCoy joined the Halo Combat Evolved team. Crimson Skies itself would also continue at Microsoft. Unofficial confirmation of a sequel had in fact come very soon after release. In a community chat with fans, members of the development team, including Microsoft project manager Chris Kimmel, openly discussed the possibility of features that could be implemented into an upcoming V2 of Crimson Skies, which they stated would be a while off. The second game was indeed some ways off, and not for PC. Crimson Skies High Road to Revenge was announced in early 2002, to be released exclusively on the Xbox in fall of that year. Development took place at FASA Studio rather than Zipper Interactive, who went on to develop the SOCOM series for the Sony PlayStation, though there was some involvement from the original Crimson Skies board game team. High Road to Revenge was closer to a reboot or standalone title than a sequel, with Microsoft explicitly distancing the game from the original, despite sharing the same background universe and protagonist. The PC game thus received a taste of its own medicine in previews of this new entry, referred to as having adopted a tedious and rigid simulationist design, in contrast to the action and adventure approach of the Xbox title. But after a disappointing showing at E3 2002, High Road to Revenge was significantly redesigned, and did not hit the Xbox until October 2003, receiving generally positive reviews but not becoming a bestseller. A third game entered production at FASA Studios but was quickly scrapped. And though the Crimson Skies franchise was kept alive with a new collectible miniatures game, a card game, and the multiplayer community for the PC and Xbox titles, Microsoft opted not to continue with the series. In 2007, Jordan Weissman licensed from Microsoft the rights to further electronic entertainment products set in the MechWarrior, Shadowrun, and Crimson Skies universes, though plans for a new Crimson Skies game did not materialize. Between 2008 and 2023, Weissman has repeatedly stated that he has been in contact with Microsoft and hopes to resurrect the franchise, though as of writing, nothing has come of these discussions. High Road to Revenge is part of Microsoft's Xbox backwards compatibility program and remains playable on current generation console hardware. Microsoft have also cited their Game Pass program as a potential means of generating interest in old properties, with Xbox head Phil Spencer singling out Crimson Skies and other former FASA properties by name. But the original PC game is no longer available for purchase, and is difficult to play on modern Windows systems due to outdated anti-piracy measures and incompatibility with new hardware. Despite these challenges, Crimson Skies has retained a small multiplayer community and received a number of fan patches to assist in running it on modern systems. Its blend of arcade aerial combat, intriguing premise, and action serial presentation remain a fond memory for many and still attract new players willing to put the work into getting it running. So let's dispense with the history of Crimson Skies and get into the game itself.
This isn't over, Zachary. Next time, I'll nail your wings to a wall.
There are three distinct modes available in Crimson Skies: a single-player campaign, an instant action mode that lets players customize and play individual missions, and a multiplayer mode, with all three modes allowing the player to build and customize their own aircraft. The focus of this video will be Crimson Skies' single-player campaign, though we'll have a quick look at the other options later in this section. Upon starting the campaign, players are introduced to the protagonist, Captain Nathan Zachary of the Fortune Hunters. Zachary and the Fortune Hunters fly around the Americas in their stolen airship Pandora, which has been modified to house several fighter and bomber wings for the crew. The player can access missions from the flight deck screen, which also lets them browse mementos they've earned as part of story progression or side objectives, replay previously completed levels, or build a new warplane, though the latter cannot be done until the player has earned enough money from the campaign. The campaign consists of 24 missions, typically with 4 or 5 grouped into a single story arc, and in many cases sharing the same map. The first set of missions are set around a Hawaiian island chain, and cover most of the same activities and gameplay mechanics that the player will encounter throughout the rest of the campaign. Once the player selects their first mission, they'll take part in a briefing between Zachary and the Pandora's crew, which explains the mission objectives and hints at what sort of challenges they might encounter. After listening to this, the player can confirm their selection of plane and ammunition and start the mission. Although at this stage there's only one plane available, the player can already access some of the different ammo and rocket types. Slugs are the basic ammunition, useful for both stripping armor plating off targets and damaging the interior components. Unsurprisingly, other ammo types have more specialist roles. AP is extremely effective against armor but does less damage to the target underneath it. Dum-dums are slightly weaker against armor but very damaging to internals, and explosive ammo does more damage to everything. It presumably has some sort of drawback, perhaps in range or firing speed, but this isn't entirely clear. The basic rockets are high explosives, which require a reasonable degree of accuracy and do high damage. Flak rockets are not as powerful but don't require a direct hit on the target and do area of effect damage, whilst armor-piercing rockets are similar to High X but destroy almost all the target's armor with a single strike. Once the player is ready to start, they can load up the first level. As an arcade combat sim, Crimson Skies doesn't require any takeoff procedures or special preparation. The level begins with a cutscene and then drops the player right into the action. The control scheme is typical of other accessibility-oriented flight sims. Players are already in flight, so the basic controls are to dive, climb, roll to the left or right, or adjust their plane's rudder if they want to perform a less acrobatic turn. The player can also adjust their throttle, which loosely speaking has the effect of slowing down or speeding up the aircraft. As you'd expect, the maximum speed, acceleration, maneuverability, and responsiveness of your plane depends on the model and any modifications the player has made to the airframe. The starting option, dubbed the Devastator, is the epitome of the jack of all trades, being fair or average in all areas. As an arcade-style flight sim, Crimson Skies is extremely liberal in its interpretation of the rules of physics. The player needn't worry themselves over factors like wind speed, and is in no danger of shearing off a wing or completely stalling their engine during an ill-advised climb. The player is also aided by what Zipper called the bounce, which quite literally bounces the player off the ground if they're in danger of crashing and try to pull up. Still, they will have to take a few basics into consideration. Setting their throttle too low, for example, especially in one of the larger and slower aircraft, will cause them to do a good impression of Icarus until they raise their speed again. The first challenge of the player's mastery of their aircraft will be to fly through a point of interest. This obstacle is the first example of what the game refers to as either danger zones or barnstorming. Crimson Skies is unusual among flight sims in that, as the developers put it, action takes place in the terrain rather than over it. Thus, a great many missions in Crimson Skies will require the player to fly at extremely low altitudes and occasionally maneuver their plane through tight spaces. Colliding with an object will cause severe damage, or more likely instant death, and the bounce system rarely applies to props, so these challenges are arguably the most difficult feats in the game. There are optional barnstorming points in almost all the missions, though in 1 or 2 levels, most notably an air race in the Hollywood chapter, these are mandatory. That covers the first side of the gameplay. The second is, of course, the action. Crimson Skies is naturally centered around air-to-air combat between warplanes, which the player will soon get a taste of in the first level. The player is always outnumbered in Crimson Skies. In most cases they'll have at least one wingman, and sometimes a full squadron on their side, but the average level will pit them against several waves of enemy planes, usually with no more than 3 to 6 active at one time. Fortunately, at the start of the game, rival pilots are generally flying slower and weaker warplanes than the players, and are sparing in their use of special weapons like rockets. Furthermore, though the Crimson Skies era is a little early for radar, the game's inbuilt targeting and spyglass mechanics serves a similar purpose. Besides, enemy AI has been programmed to, as the developers put it, live dangerously and die gloriously, in that their priorities are divided between shooting the player down and making the player feel cool about shooting them down. Thus, their behaviour revolves around looking cinematic more than anything else, surprising and menacing the player, or leading them on a joyride through the environment as they try to line up a shot. Once an enemy is in Zachary's crosshairs, the player can begin blasting away with their machine guns or rockets. Whether they actually score hits depends on their accuracy and range from the target. Though Crimson Skies aids the player with sometimes quite aggressive auto-aim, lining up a direct line of fire is going to result in more hits than spraying bullets at a target moving vertically or diagonally across the screen. The player will know they're doing damage as they see smoke and debris coming off the enemy, and once they see fire coming off part of a plane, the armor has been removed from that location. After this, it shouldn't be long before the target is sent hurtling to the earth in a blazing ball of fire. Of course, the enemy will occasionally find the time to try and fill Zachary's plane full of holes, which is where the player's own armor and locational damage system comes in. All aircraft in Crimson Skies have individual components with their own health meter, each surrounded by a layer of armor plating. The player will know when they're taking fire, both from visual and audio cues and the cockpit readings, which will show parts of the plane flashing as they take damage. Whilst protected by armor, a plane can absorb fire without immediate consequence, but once that armor is stripped away, their internal components will start taking damage. If an individual component takes too much damage, it will start to fail. Thus, an engine block with less than 25% health will limit the plane's maximum throttle, for example, and if the plane takes too much damage overall, Zachary will be forced to bail out. Dogfights in Crimson Skies thus require manoeuvring into a good position, accurate fire, and some airborne acrobatics to shake any tails. Any individual fight in Crimson Skies can be won with the default slugs and high explosive rockets, but ammo is limited, and with one notable exception, there's no way to replenish it in mission. The first level also introduces the other type of foe common to many missions, which is the Zeppelin. The airship in the first level is a stripped-down version with a limited number of turrets and a conspicuously vulnerable cargo of flammable materials slung under its soft spot, but otherwise mimics the behaviour of regular Zeppelins. Once the player has buzzed some points of interest, shot down the enemy aircraft, and destroyed the Zeppelin, they can return to the Pandora and finish the level. This introduces the docking mechanic, in which the player has to try and fly their plane into the Zeppelin's docking hook without crashing. Although manually docking with the Pandora is dropped later on, and can be bypassed with a hotkey anyway, the feat itself is a mandatory objective that will be used in other levels, such as hijacking a bomber, smuggling crewmen onto enemy Zeppelins, and rescuing allies from a moving train. These basic activities, barnstorming, dogfighting, Zeppelin busting, and docking, are all repeated throughout the rest of the game. As the player progresses through the campaign, the depth and variety found within these activities increases. For example, the second and third levels introduce a new aircraft, the British Balmoral bomber. Whereas the Devastator was an all-rounder, the Balmoral represents the extremes of durability and firepower at the cost of speed and maneuverability. This flying fortress has more airframe hardpoints than the Devastator, meaning it can carry more guns and rockets. By default, it also uses heavier 50 caliber guns as opposed to the 40 calibers used by the Devastator. It also has substantially heavier armor, to the point that it can usually survive collisions with smaller warplanes. And it carries an extra turret that will automatically target and fire on nearby enemies. But it's also much slower, less responsive, and more difficult to maneuver than the Devastator. Later, the player will also acquire the Bloodhawk, which is considerably less well armed than the Balmoral, but is extremely fast and even includes a nitro booster that lets the player gain a sudden burst of speed. More exotic plane types will become available further down the line, such as the Hoplite, a poorly armed and armoured gyrocopter with excellent manoeuvrability, not so formidable in a protracted air battle, but ideal for barnstorming. Coming back to the second level, we're also introduced to Sir Charles Emmett Winthrop, Royal Air Force ace. Enemy aces fly modified airframes with far better weapons and armor plating than regular foes. They're also much better pilots than their subordinates, regularly pulling off heart-stopping stunts to try and shake any tails. But perhaps their most important characteristic is their aggression. As soon as they appear, aces will often head straight for Zachary, meaning that you'll be forced to confront them before trying to focus on any other objectives. Winthrop is one of the less threatening aces you'll run into, but later nemeses will be flying considerably more powerful warplanes. But aces aren't the only new enemies you'll encounter. Regular pilots will fly a greater variety of warplanes and display more variance in flying skill. One level might pit you against a swarm of nimble gyrocopters, then a squadron of advanced fighters. There'll also be plenty of other types of foes to be found on land, sea, and air. Watchtowers and anti-air bunkers will launch rockets at the skies. Patrol boats will pepper you with machine gun fire, and steel-framed defense balloons will float into your path. Eventually, the player will also encounter fully operational passenger Zeppelins and military-grade airships. These will appear with progressively more dangerous defensive capabilities, the former sporting heavy turrets and bellies full of escort fighters, and the latter bolstered with high explosive and flak rocket emplacements. By the halfway point of the campaign, the fortune hunters will have to contend with Zeppelins carrying anti-airship cannons that can blow the Pandora out of the sky. These Goliaths have only two real weaknesses: their propeller engines, which can be shot off with regular gunfire, and their cannon ports, which are vulnerable to rockets and heavy weapons whilst exposed. But by the time they reach that point, the player and their adversaries will also have unlocked more exotic weapons. These include rockets that can stun, deafen or blind enemy pilots, temporarily disable their engines, or spit out a cloud of thick smoke to reduce visibility around the player. A beeper-seeker system of homing rockets will also become available, and finally, an anti-Zeppelin torpedo. The campaign will frequently fluctuate between testing the player's flying, dogfighting, strafing, and Zeppelin-busting skills. One moment the player might be dive-bombing an airfield, the next saving the Pandora from a flight of Bloodhawks. The player will occasionally be forced into flying a specific aircraft for one of these missions, but most of the time the choice is up to them. No one plane is perfect for every activity. In one case, a Balmoral might be best for duking it out with several waves of fighters. In another, the Hoplite is required for tight maneuvers. Of course, the player can head to the plane construction menu to try and build a more well-rounded aircraft, or whatever they think best fits their playstyle. This feature is also available in the game's other modes, and revolves around the core of first choosing the airframe, then customizing the technical details around this. The airframe is the base model being used, be it the Devastator, the Balmoral, the Bloodhawk, or any of the other planes available in Crimson Skies. Each airframe has a base cost and a maximum weight, which regulates the quality, power, and weight of the components chosen for the aircraft. Using this base, the player can make extensive customizations to the airframe. They could swap out the engine for a lighter and slower model, and use the spare weight to improve the front armor. Or maybe they prefer speed and remove some of their guns so they can carry a nitro booster. Or they might remove some of the rocket hardpoints and upgrade their rear turret with a couple of 70 calibers. Finally, they can customize the paint job to match their personal taste or mimic one of the famous gangs or air militias. It all depends on their individual playstyle or the specific role they want that plane to fulfill. Although building planes costs money, the player can have a previous build refunded in full whenever they wish. None of this is necessary to finish the campaign, as the player will acquire a variety of unique aircraft that cover all of the different challenges. Aside from the plane construction and weapons customization, the campaign is more or less entirely linear. The player completes 4 or 5 levels, moves on to the next chapter, and repeats until the end. But within certain levels, there's sometimes variation in objectives or side activities. In one level, the player can choose whether to secure their escape by crippling a Zeppelin, or by setting a fuel tanker ablaze, and can also try to intercept a fleeing speedboat to earn a greater reward at the end of the mission. In another mission, they have to complete their objectives before the arrival of enemy reinforcements, but can choose to stay and fight anyway. And nearly every mission has some replay value for those who want to hit all the available barnstorming spots. Optional objectives will earn the player one of 3 rewards: either more cash, a screenshot of their daring feat of flying, or a memento for their logbook, which might be a letter, a newspaper clipping, a photo, or something of the like. Finally, although according to the developers Crimson Skies was primarily focused on the single-player campaign, it's also worth mentioning the other 2 modes available, multiplayer and instant action. I didn't try the former, but it was very popular for some time after release, with fan sites and regional squadrons and the like. A small player base remains active on the Crimson Skies community and Crimson Skies PC multiplayer discords, which you can find through the Crimson Skies subreddit. You can still take part in matches, though due to the shutdown of MSN Game Zone, games are conducted and organised through Game Ranger and community chat. The match types available include Deathmatch, Capture the Flag, and Zep vs Zep, and players are able to set a variety of parameters like match length, respawn rules, and what weapons or plane types are permitted. The instant action mode is essentially a custom mission builder for single player. There are a number of preset missions available, but the player can ignore these and set up their own. They can customize their plane, number of wingmen, mission type, location, enemy crews or militia, number of enemies, their aircraft, and skill level. Instant action is therefore a quick and easy method of jumping into some spicy air action, and due to the lack of an in-game tutorial, is also a convenient way for the player to practice stunt flying, dogfighting, and Zeppelin raids before returning to the campaign mode. There's a lot you can get out of an arcade flight sim. For some, it's the basic appeal of the action, the thrill of soaring through sky or space, dodging fire and playing chicken with enemy aces, hurtling towards the ground in some crazy stunt, or playing the lone hero against overwhelming odds. For others, it's jumping into the cockpit of a craft from a favourite license or real-life history, be it a TIE Fighter or a Thomas Brothers T2. The latter group are often as much interested in the setting itself as they are the gameplay, and it's in the overlap between these two groups that we see a little of what it is that attracts the dadcore demographic to real flight sims. Because if aerial combat fans were only interested in the action, there'd be little place for arcade flight hits like the Red Baron games or Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe. Whereas space combat games can at least boast laser cannons, capital ships, afterburners, energy shields, photon torpedoes and such, historical titles revolve around sluggish, propeller-based aircraft that are one abrupt turn away from tearing themselves in two. The appeal in these is partly in what these aircraft can't do as much as what they can. The joy is in mastering their limitations, in feeling at one with the hum of their engines, knowing how far they can be pushed before they stall, how low you can go before it becomes impossible to pull out of a fatal dive. In marketing Crimson Skies, Weissman and his peers talked a lot about action and immersion, shooting and style, but did their best to distance themselves from the technical limitations of the quasi-historical craft featured in-game. Whether they talked about it or not, it was nevertheless an important part of the gameplay experience. Zipper's Graham Case referred to Crimson Skies as Quake in a plane, but I think this is a poor analogy outside of marketing purposes. The player can't rely solely on their flying skills to get them out of tough situations in Crimson Skies. They can't strafe dodge or rocket jump out of danger. The original board game was marketed as being a blend of action, accessibility, and strategy, in that players had to think carefully about their aircraft and how they were positioned on the board before anything else. Zipper's game is true to this. No matter how fancy a flyer you are, flying a gyrocopter alongside a Zeppelin with an ace on your tail is not going to end well, nor is attempting to barnstorm in a Balmoral, nor docking with a Zeppelin in a Bloodhawk at full throttle. Choosing the right plane, the right armament, and the right strategy is a necessity, not only in-game, but before booting up Crimson Skies in the first place. There's a strange omission in Crimson Sky's manual. Though the keys for viewports, changing weapons, targeting, and the usual commands are all listed, the keyboard controls for basic movement, climbing, diving, rolling, and turning, are relegated to the back cover. When the designers introduce the basic controls to the player, it's for a flight stick. An odd choice considering how desperate Weisman and the team were to avoid the perception Crimson Skies was anything but an accessible, instant action alternative to flight sims. Perhaps this was Microsoft's choice, but whatever the motivation, it embodies the first of many tensions that arose from the blend of accessible action and immersive aerial combat. Whatever else it is, Crimson Skies is about piloting a plane, and no matter how simplified or sweetened the control scheme and handling, this is the domain of flight sticks. Let's not overstate the problem. Crimson Skies is playable from start to finish with a keyboard and maybe a mouse, though the latter is not recommended other than for combat keys. That's how I and many other casual fans played it back in the day. But as at least 2 contemporary reviews pointed out, it doesn't feel like it's supposed to be played that way. There's a good reason the most notoriously difficult missions in Crimson Skies are the mandatory barnstorming ones, in particular the Hollywood Air Race, which requires flying a high-speed plane through hangars, archways, crevices, and underpasses, then fighting a series of aerial duels. I distinctly remember this level turning me into a screaming wreck as a teenager. I can say with virtual certainty I probably used the skip level feature and came back to it much later. It's not that dogfighting and zeppelin busting can't be challenging in Crimson Skies, it's just that a lot of that can be mitigated with good positioning, predicting your enemy's flight path, and having the right ammo or rockets in stock. Assuming you picked the right plane for the job, the barnstorming sequences are purely a test of players' piloting skills, and Crimson Skies can actually be quite frustrating here for keyboard jockeys. Controls are one thing when you're flying hundreds of feet above the trees or skimming the ground, but calculating and controlling your descent through a crashed zeppelin or between a couple of palm trees is another matter. To some extent, I think this could have been mitigated with a tutorial. The first mission is fine for teaching you how to fly, but at the very least, it really needed to push the player into adjusting their throttle, which is a crucial skill to master in later barnstorming sections and for dogfighting with the more maneuverable enemies. Maybe Zipper didn't have time to make optional tutorial missions, or it was felt a flying tutorial would detract from the image of accessibility. In any case, no matter how much the player practices, piloting safely through danger zones is the biggest challenge in the game. That's why I have some sympathy for Edge magazine's notorious 5 out of 10 review. The score itself seems rather extreme. Keep in mind that Edge long had a reputation for this sort of thing. For reference, the beloved Command & Conquer Red Alert 2 received the same dismal rating just above the Crimson Skies review. But the magazine's central complaint, that the difficulty of maneuvering your plane through tight spaces made players too cautious, is, in my opinion, a fair observation. Barnstorming is such a dangerous activity that the player is safer throwing themselves at a squadron of fighters or facing down a military airship. It discourages the theatricality of daring aerobatics, particularly when they come at a sensitive spot in a mission. Nobody enjoys surviving a 10-minute aerial duel and humiliating an enemy ace, then crashing unceremoniously into a suspension cable. This isn't helped by the fact AI pilots are programmed to dive through danger zones when under attack, which occasionally just looks plain silly, but is also aggravating since you feel like a coward for not following them, even though it's also blatantly obvious they're cheating due to passing through solid objects or being teleported out of a guaranteed crash. Action games can live or die based on their controls and responsiveness, but an arcade flight sim has to balance this with at least the vague sense that you're actually flying an aircraft, as well as modelling some level of meaningful differences between how the different options handle. In fact, compared to similar games of the early 90s, Luftwaffe, Red Baron, Air Power and such, it's especially forgiving. But those games didn't ask you to pilot an 8,000-pound warplane through the Abu Simbel. If there's an easy solution to this, combining dogfighting with aerial stunts without throwing out the physics of flight entirely, I don't know of it. I suppose it's partly a question of recognising the limitations of the model. I've never played the Xbox Crimson Skies, for example, but my understanding is that they made the physics and controls even more forgiving, only to sabotage themselves with unreasonably difficult obstacle courses in a couple of the later levels. It illustrates how the aircraft controls themselves are less important than matching the in-game challenges to the average player's piloting skills. Besides, in other areas, Zipper went to extremes in coddling the amateur aviator. The most obvious is the addition of the targeting and spyglass mechanic, which ensures the player will always know what hostiles are in the vicinity, as well as the exact position of an individual threat at all times. There's no chance of a particularly cunning foe diving into the clouds and turning the tables on a pursuing player, or a panicked moment of terror as a pack of gyrocopters descend from above. Each enemy is marked with a huge red selection box, with different options for prioritizing targets. This can be turned off, though you'll have to do it every single time you enter a mission, and it certainly feels as if the game wants you to make use of it. Your co-pilot will occasionally yell out the location of enemies, but it's inconsistent and usually unhelpful. In CGW, Charles Ardai suggested that rather than having regular difficulties, which as far as I can tell only affect damage and the AI, it would have been better to have a sim mode and an action mode, depending on the player's preferences. I agree with this, especially if the player were able to customize how much the game assisted them, completely disabling auto-aim but leaving the ground bounce intact, or only activating the more difficult AI behavior and so on. Doing this well probably would have been unrealistic. The game as a whole had to be designed around one or the other, but being able to tweak the simness of Crimson Skies would have improved the game's replayability quite a bit. Because though many reviewers were dismissive of the value of features like the campaign mementos, side objectives, and optional barnstorming, the game does have a good degree of replay value. For all the issues with the controls, the basic Crimson Skies experience, dogfighting with other planes, is good fun. I believe John Howard mentioned that the team were surprised by how popular the game's instant action mode was, but I'm not sure why this would be such a shock to them. They made it clear they were doing everything in their power to make an action game, to make the player feel like a real ace pilot, so surely they were expecting a plug-and-play custom mission mode to prove a hit. Too many games have extra gameplay modes like New Game Plus or Arena mode or whatever, but it's sometimes the case that the appeal of these is simply in having something to waste time on, watching numbers or ranks go up until you get bored again. Instant action works because the aerial combat in Crimson Skies is a solid and enjoyable base to build the rest of the game around. It's fun to jump into a random dogfight, and it's also fun to practice enough that you genuinely feel your aeronautical skills have improved. That's why it would have felt really rewarding to be able to return to the campaign mode and replay missions with more of the arcade features disabled, taking off the proverbial training wheels and making you feel more like a real ace. I suppose you could argue that an extra hardcore mode was redundant. I imagine that for many players, this point, the apex of their confidence, is when they decided to brave the crucible of online aerial duels. Perhaps this was Weisman & Co.'s plan all along. Crimson Skies did, after all, begin as a prototype for a VR multiplayer combat sim, and there are few foes more challenging or rewarding to beat than another human being.
So you have human skill versus human skill. It's not a redundant computer that's just memorizing cycles. You have to play against someone who's got imagination and creativity.
So it will be man against man. No one gets hurt, of course. It's just battling graphics controlled by individual players.
But not everyone likes, or back in the 2000s, had convenient access to online gaming, so it's still a shame there weren't more options to modify your single-player experience. On the subject of variety, I mentioned earlier that the developers mentioned having to streamline both the multiplayer and instant action options. A strafing or bombing run mode was stated outright, as well as vaguer reference to alternative multiplayer game types. The justification for this was the heavy focus on the single-player campaign. There was obviously a push to try as many different approaches as possible with the single-player missions. The first mission involves scouting an island, taking out a bridge, dropping an ally onto a shipwreck, fighting some rival pirates, setting off explosive cargo, and then docking with the Pandora. Another has you rescue an ally from a moving train, detonate fuel trucks as a distraction, down all the private air militia sent to stop you, steal an experimental aircraft, and then duel an ace. But we can categorize these into a handful of activities. Shoot at planes, shoot at things on the ground, shoot at things on a zeppelin, fly very close to something, or fly through something. PC Zone's review politely grumbled that Crimson Skies was an instant gratification kind of game, a positive in some ways, but a game that in their view leaned a bit too much into the instant, whose replay value was derived solely from the throwaway fun factor or its multiplayer. Like I said, in my opinion, that throwaway fun factor, that is, the actual gameplay, is enough to keep people occupied for a good while, but it's not unreasonable for some to consider Crimson Skies a bit lightweight. For flight sim fans, or perhaps those who enjoyed space combat games, it could have used some of the granularity of managing flight instruments and regulating fuel or power systems, commanding wingmen, or something that's surprisingly not already part of the campaign, investing in your planes with upgrades and such. Because of the way the campaign is balanced, which often promotes switching to different aircraft for specific missions, and the technical limitations of the plane construction, which prevent you reopening a previous build and adjusting it, you don't get especially attached to your warplanes. Whilst you'll undoubtedly have a favourite for general dogfighting, and you can customise the paint job a bit, it doesn't really feel like you have much ownership over them. Nor do you feel a special attachment to the Pandora, your crew, and the rest of your little fleet. Some of the titles that influenced or may have influenced Crimson Skies, such as Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, offered players the opportunity to engage with operational and strategic elements of the air war, such as running their own squadron. Air Power went as far as to merge aerial combat with basic Empire management, including a strategic map and factors like morale, diplomacy, reconnaissance, repair and resupply, escort orders, and different mission types to consider. There's no particular reason that under normal circumstances a Fortune Hunters game wouldn't be dealing with some of these same issues. During the campaign, the story is sometimes moved forward by Zachary needing to refuel the Pandora or expand his air fleet. But that kind of scope would have been a difficult sell to Microsoft, who were already a little skeptical of the arcade flight sim idea, and I don't think I've seen any evidence Weisman, McCoy, or Howard were ever interested in taking that approach. Everything I've read of Crimson Skies' conception and development indicates the focus was always air combat, the aeronautics, and the aesthetics, not running a Zeppelin or a persistent campaign map. One CNET review complained that the game's marketing had been deceptive in playing up the concept of an interactive storyline, and somewhat similar descriptions do appear in early marketing and foreign language previews of Crimson Skies. But I've not seen anything like this promised in any of the interviews with Weisman and the team leading up to release, so I think it was just a misunderstanding based on over-enthusiastic marketing of the campaign's narrative focus. Anyone watching who's familiar with High Road to Revenge might have a very faint sense of déjà vu here. The Xbox game was originally designed around a so-called interactive movie format, but this was deemed too restrictive, and it spent a year being retooled into a more conventional mission structure, albeit with a hub system and side activities. Maybe the interactive movie idea had been kicked about during the development of the original Crimson Skies, and it got lost in translation and reached the ears of some journalists as some sort of non-linear campaign structure. It's certainly another possible avenue that could have been taken with the PC game. Not a strategic campaign, but a sort of fighting fantasy gamebook system, where Zachary would be presented with different choices during or between missions, like choosing to trust one character over another, or deciding which of two plans best fit the next heist. This system has certainly found its way into plenty of other titles you wouldn't expect to find it, including FPS and RTS games. An OnScene64 article on the cancelled Crimson Skies 3 even claims that FASA Studio wanted to go further with the open world options teased with High Road to Revenge, allowing the player to leave their plane and explore hub areas between flights. But as interesting as all these thought experiments are, they're starting to give this video the air of a post-mortem, as if picking over the corpse of a failed game. Crimson Skies might not have the depth and detail of a flight sim or a cross-genre title like Air Power, but it never needed to go that route. Games that reached for the stars and got partway sometimes age better than competent but unremarkable ones. You often come across older games with limited aspirations that met their goals and then dutifully shuffled aside to make way for newer titles, and though they might have been worth talking about back in the day, it's difficult to find interesting things to say about them today. Crimson Skies doesn't fit so neatly into either of those categories. It was a flight sim trying to be an action game, which certainly posed challenges in production and marketing, but is hardly a particularly courageous or historic ambition. But neither is Crimson Skies a beneficiary of low expectations, because what they were aiming for, to make the player feel like an aerial ace, is a fundamentally exciting fantasy that holds up over 20 years later. Crimson Skies set itself a relatively modest goal, but that goal remains a remarkably attractive proposition for anyone who likes fast planes, big guns, and gorgeous dames. And don't forget, aerial combat wasn't the Crimson Skies team's only aim. It wasn't just about flying a plane, it was about flying a particular kind of plane, in a particular era, meeting a particular kind of person, and listening to a particular kind of music. That era, or at least the fantastical one crafted by FASA, was of Hollywood and Howard Hughes, of Tailspin Tommy and Chattanooga Choo Choo. It was a world in which Weisman, McCoy, and many others at FASA had invested a great deal of work, formulating the looks and sounds of everything from speedometers to saxophones. Technical staff and artists at both Zipper and Microsoft Game Studio also contributed to this vision and brought it to life. It was as big an ambition as any gameplay innovation, and we'll give it the recognition it deserves in the next part of the video.
Okay, that one hit.
You stirred the hornet's nest, darling. No! Not again! Not bloody again!
You have seriously got to think about a new line of work, my friend.
Defensive fire commencing!
In an IGN interview, John Howard credited the sights and sounds of Crimson Skies to pirates, crazy Nazi prototypes, Errol Flynn and Hollywood's golden age, swing music, Black Sheep Squadron, Flying Tigers, Hell's Angels, Indiana Jones, Betty Page, and the pin-up art of Alberto Vargas and George Petty. Other interviews with the team mentioned Star Wars, radio dramas in general, and comics like Flying Aces and G8. In essence, Crimson Skies was a salute to 1937, albeit viewed through the lens of both contemporaneous media and later tributes to the period. Of course, as with any homage, what Vassar defined as the 30s was subject to creative liberties. The designs that inspired Crimson Skies aircraft were mostly from World War II and beyond, and Betty Page didn't start modelling until 1950. As with any nostalgic revival, the realities of times, dates, and historical accuracy are secondary concerns. The 1930s and everything about them obviously were and are an enormous inspiration for both audiences and creators, but as with all things, their popularity waxes and wanes with the spirit of the times. When the Crimson Skies board game entered development in the mid to late 90s, it found itself chasing the tail end of a short-lived revival of cinematic tributes to interwar serials and comic books. Many of these pulp-inspired projects had been in development since the 70s or 80s, but even after the success of Indiana Jones, the properties were often viewed by studios as too campy and out of touch with modern audiences, tarred as superhero movies, not a favourable comparison at the time due to the diminishing returns of the Superman franchise. But after the success of Tim Burton's Batman, pulp and comic book heroes didn't seem like such a risky investment, resulting in productions like 1991's The Rocketeer, 1994's The Shadow, or 1996's The Phantom. Unfortunately, most of these serial-inspired blockbusters were critical and financial letdowns, and by the time of Crimson Skies' home computer release, only hits like 1999's The Mummy saved pulp from becoming hopelessly passé. The aesthetics of Crimson Skies are thus somewhat Frankensteinian, some parts taken from the 30s, some from the 40s and 50s, and some parts from the 80s and 90s that were themselves recycled from earlier periods. We'll talk a little about historical overlap and how it affects the tone of Crimson Skies later in the video, but for now, let's take a look at some of those weird and wonderful planes that was such a selling point for the game. In some cases, they were lifted directly from real life, the most obvious being Howard Hughes' famous H-4 Hercules, better known in the press as the Spruce Goose. Others were influenced by the so-called X-planes developed for Germany's Luftwaffe in the 30s and 40s, such as the Henschel P-75 heavy fighter or the high-speed P-87 Schnellbomber. And although Crimson Skies focused on propeller aircraft, a major aesthetic influence were radical jet-powered Wunderwaffen, such as various models of the Horton Flying Wings, dubbed America bombers due to their supposed transatlantic strike capabilities. Some of these aircraft were pure fantasy, never even reaching the prototype phase. Cynics speculate they were designed primarily to court funding from credulous and desperate superiors, and spare those working on them from being sent to the Eastern Front. Still, some were used in test flights, and a handful, such as the Messerschmitt Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor craft, saw action against the Allies towards the end of the war. But not every craft in Crimson Skies was based on Luftwaffe designs, as many other famous planes and prototypes of the period, like the Bristol Beaufighters, Curtiss-Wright XP-55, Hughes XF-11, Vought F-4U Corsair, and countless others also appear in whole or in part. Meanwhile, the iconic airships of Count Verden and von Zeppelin need no introduction, with Vassar and the team having merged real-life designs with the heavily armed seagoing galleons of the 16th to 18th centuries. In the real world, Zeppelins were primarily used for scouting, high-altitude bombing, and tourism or propaganda, falling out of favour due to numerous technical challenges, innovations in naval engineering, and the development of anti-Zeppelin weapons like incendiary ammunition. Freed of the tyranny of real-life limitations, their potential as carriers and dreadnoughts is brought to life in Crimson Skies, depicted as sky-borne battleships bristling with cannons and escort fighters. But as impressive as they are in the air, Zeppelins are best known in the eyes of the public due to the Hindenburg disaster of 1937. Unsurprisingly, the spectacular fiery destruction of the craft, coming after a series of similar high-profile disasters in France, Britain, and America, marked the end of the airship era, but became a marquee image of the Crimson Skies franchise. In a developer diary, 3D artist David Kern revealed that he was instructed to model damaged and destroyed Zeppelins directly off footage of the Hindenburg disaster, but that this was changed due to the speed, spread, and size of the real-life conflagration. According to Kern, machines of the day simply wouldn't have been able to model the number of particles required to mimic such a large fire, not to mention the likelihood that players would have been too busy to enjoy it. Instead, Zeppelins in Crimson Skies were divided into individual gas bag sections, which would burn and explode independently of one another, easing the strain on hardware and increasing the chances of players being able to witness an airship's demise. This issue of optimization was a persistent concern during the game's development, with official statements first claiming the game was targeting a minimum requirement of 200 MHz processors, which was later raised to 266. Though already utilising MechWarrior 3's Game Z engine, there were some notable technical innovations that arose from the collaboration between Zipper and Microsoft staff. One was the clutter system, which allowed the engine to render seamless ground environments together with large numbers of both fixed and procedurally generated props. Another was the representation of credible but resource-light cloud effects. Zipper co-founder Brian Soderbergh apparently held multiple patents on realistic cloud rendering software. Despite these efforts, Crimson Skies wasn't the most visually cutting-edge title on the market in late 2000. Due to the massive environments, large 3D models, and heavy use of particle effects, it had to make optimizations wherever possible to get the thing running at a playable frame rate. The most obvious of these are the 2D trees and simplistic NPC models, the latter being well below the quality of first and third person rivals of the day for obvious reasons. There's a dramatic moment later in the game where a cutscene focuses on someone parachuting out of a plane, but the asset is such low quality, as if they'd been run over by a steamroller, it just made me burst out laughing. Smoke trails, fires, and explosions are generally high quality, though I remember thinking the aerial torpedo detonations quite a letdown even back at release. These limitations aren't just a matter of taste, but actually have a very noticeable effect on the gameplay. The game can be extremely aggressive with LOD streaming and pop-in, resulting in some objects coming into view when you're almost on top of them. You don't notice this so much early on, but it does become bothersome in the Colorado environment, as you have to fly through danger zones where certain props don't appear when it's almost too late to react. There are few things more disheartening than being killed by a pair of massive metal mammaries. Where this becomes a really severe problem is in the Empire State map. Crimson Skies cover and promo art depicted daytime dogfights through the spires of America's metropolises, but no such scenes occur in-game. The only real urban environment is permanently set to after hours, I would speculate due to technical limitations with the number of large 3D buildings that would need to be rendered at once. But even on top of this, there are some really blatant tricks used to further limit visibility, like thick black fog, obvious seams where the landscape transitions to nothingness, and worst of all, skyscrapers represented by a handful of night lights until you've almost smashed into them. The final point is both ugly and sometimes frustrating, and was mentioned by several reviews of the day. Perhaps it would have been better to add weather effects like a heavy storm to justify the reduced draw distance. Pretty much all the assets and effects have been thoroughly outclassed by later titles, partly I think due to the game taking a semi-photorealistic approach, which was and still is the standard for most flight sims. The obvious observation to make here is that the graphics would have aged better with a more stylized approach, perhaps classic comic book or even Art Deco. It certainly would have made for an interesting look, but I think photorealism, even when severely dated, can help give a sense of grounding. If you compare the original game to High Road to Revenge, which came out in 2003 and was optimised for what had been at release the relatively powerful Xbox hardware, the latter features a number of improvements. There are gorgeous lighting and shader effects all over the place, rain-slick surfaces, fire explosions, reflective surfaces, hazy skies, pre-rendered movies, storytelling, and so on and so forth. But it's also more cartoonish than the original PC game, which isn't necessarily a negative, just gives the game a different feel even before changes to the setting and tone. It's a shame the Xbox game got updated for backwards compatibility, but the PC game still doesn't even have native widescreen support. I appreciate that Microsoft is merely a small family company, but an HD re-release of Crimson Skies, with the pop-in and similar optimizations removed, would make the game so much more immersive. Oh, and higher definition pin-up girls would be nice. You just know someone at Microsoft took the originals home. As for sound, there was a bit of a mixed response to Crimson Sky's audio work. Some reviewers were thrilled by the powerful hum of engines, the heavy drumming of 70 caliber cannons, and the shrill alarm of sirens as a Zeppelin opens its cannon ports. But a few commented that the sound effects were limited, repetitive, or of mediocre quality. Balancing audio was no doubt a big challenge in Crimson Skies, as it has to work with both the interior cockpit and exterior third-person perspectives. There are a lot of effects going on at any one time, from the player's engine as well as those of nearby wingmen or zeppelins, enemy planes screaming past, bullets whizzing past the cockpit or going wide, your own guns blazing, and of course feedback from events occurring further away that under normal circumstances a pilot wouldn't be able to hear over the wind, like police sirens, trains, faraway explosions, crackling flames and all the rest. Not only all that, but a major part of the sound design is the almost incessant radio chatter of Zachary, the fortune hunters, their adversaries, and anyone else who wants to join in on the conversation. During normal gameplay, there are warnings from your co-pilots and status updates from wingmen, plus taunts and cursing from enemy pilots. Pretty much every campaign mission also features a lot of scripted dialogue, Zachary giving orders, the Pandora crew remarking on mission objectives and various other events, arguments or flirting with opposing aces, or panicked broadcasts from civilians and air militia.
I'll drink to that! I don't believe it! You did it! You got them all! On behalf of the entire crew of the Compassion, our deepest thanks! You fortune hunters are real heroes!
I wouldn't go that far.
You rarely feel alone with your thoughts during Crimson Skies campaign, which might be an irritant to some players, but I think most will get a lot out of it and feel like the protagonists of a classic 30s serial. The general banter is typical of pulp media, with a similar blend of pantomime rivalry and swashbuckling wit.
Nathan Zachary. So, we meet again. It'll be an honor to shoot you down again.
Don't expect to be so lucky this time, Debutante Steele.
For some reason, the voice acting talent used in Crimson Skies doesn't appear to be listed in either the manual or in-game, merely crediting Sound Deluxe Showworks for VO recording and editing. IMDb lists longtime TV actor and voiceover artist Daniel Riordan as Nathan Zachary, plus MechWarrior 3's Joel Stopka as Marshall Redman, but the most extensive list I could find was David Henry's Dev Diary, which confirms Riordan as Zachary and states he was supported by, quote, David A. Thomas, Adam Paul, Kevin Killebrew, Gray Delisle, Tassia Valenza, Eugene Roche, and many others. The problem is the roles they played are not mentioned. Other sources listing the VAs appear to confuse the game with High Road to Revenge. According to Henry, the inspiration for the actors' performances were period radio plays, such as CBS Radio's Mystery Theatre, plus classics like The Shadow, Suspense, and The Whistler. Charles Ardai wasn't a fan of the approach, saying that it sounded stilted, as if the actors were all delivering their lines with an ironic smirk. Ardai argued that Indiana Jones should be the benchmark for serial tributes, implausible and outrageous adventures whose swaggering participants nevertheless view them with the utmost seriousness. It's hard to fault the acting in context, as radio serials were narrated according to both the limitations of technology and media trends of the day. I listened to some episodes of The Shadow from 1937, and the Crimson Skies action theatre shorts, which were available on the game's website, didn't sound too out of place in comparison.
Nathan, I've got you now. Sorry, you were an amusing dance partner. Nice flying, lover. Maybe you're as good in a plane as you are on the dance floor.
Thanks for the compliment. Let me return it.
On the other hand, I was surprised to learn that the in-game dialogue was recorded with all the actors present in the studio, as there are numerous awkward and unnatural pauses beyond those of classic radio serials. I assume this was done out of necessity to avoid overlapping audio and make it easier to use the recordings during gameplay. So whilst I can't complain about the actors' delivery, I do think this problem diminishes both the effect and the authenticity of their performances. The third leg of Crimson Sky's audio design is the music. Naturally, this was a big part of establishing the game's period-appropriate mood, combining 30s newsreel pomp with classic action-adventure and aviation movies of the era, from Captain Blood to the Dawn Patrol. Microsoft's Stan Lepard, who passed away in February 2021, is credited for all the in-game tracks. Lepard would go on to contribute to Microsoft's flight sims and many other titles, including High Road to Revenge, Halo 3 ODST, Guild Wars 2, Destiny, and many more. At the time of writing, both his original SoundCloud and YouTube accounts are still up, as are some memorial channels. Outside of cutscenes, most of the in-game music in Crimson Skies was arranged in such a way as to dynamically transition from tension to combat to stingers to victory themes and back, which works wonderfully in-game but made it bloody hard to use for the intro to this video. I ended up using a theme from an old trailer which may not even have been composed by Lepard. But the soundtrack isn't all newsreels and serial themes. As David Henry put it, swing music was a no-brainer. The perfect capstone to shaking a tail off your six, forcing an enemy ace to hit the silk, and then flying off into the sunset. Marketing for the game played up the fact that a real swing band was used to record these tracks, though comments by Stan Lepard indicate that due to budget limitations, it was a very small swing band. By and large, reviewers adored Crimson Sky's soundtrack, the only negative comments I could find being that the main theme was simultaneously catchy and repetitive, and another that the overall tone was jaunty to a fault. As someone who's not a huge fan of music of the era, I personally find movie soundtracks of the early to mid-20th century rather obnoxious. I really enjoyed the Crimson Skies score, especially some of the combat music, but as with the voice acting, I'm sure one's tolerance for self-conscious kitsch will be a factor. By now, you've probably gotten the impression I'm a pretty big fan of Crimson Skies, and you'd be right, so it's frustrating for me to report that getting your hands on the game and playing it is a bit of an inconvenience. Like many PC games of the late 90s and early 2000s, Crimson Skies has a few problems with modern machines, not least retail copies being shipped with the abominable safe disk anti-piracy tech. Later versions of Windows are no longer compatible with this beloved invention, so good luck getting the game to run from CD on Windows Vista and above. Unfortunately, there are other unintentional but inevitable issues that crop up when running Crimson Skies on today's hardware. The most obvious problems are the lack of widescreen support, compatibility with higher resolutions, and interference from Windows if installed to the default program files directory. Also serious, and common to games of its day, is the fact that the game wasn't programmed to run on multi-threaded processors, high refresh rate monitors, or modern GPUs. This can cause a multitude of issues depending on your machine, from severe visual glitches, to crashes, to the game stuttering and hitching or randomly running too fast or too slow. There's no one catch-all solution to these issues, as they can depend on the specific operating system and hardware you're using. Nvidia users, for example, can experiment with one set of tweaks. Radeon customers will have to try a different set. The two most commonly recommended solutions are either CS-Fix or the DG Voodoo wrapper, both of which assume the game is already patched to v1.02. The former method is probably the quickest and simplest. Back up your crimson.exe, download the CS-Fix, put the files in the game's main directory, and set the resolution in the config file. Unfortunately, this causes some visual glitches of its own. The DG Voodoo method is slightly more complicated, requiring both a DirectX wrapper and a patch, but might work better for some people. Grab the resolution patch first and put it in the main folder, then get the DG Voodoo wrapper. Once you've downloaded DG Voodoo and transferred the relevant files over, it's recommended you configure the options as shown here from the Widescreen Gaming forum. Once again, it's not a 100% perfect solution and has its own bugs, but I personally found this method the most reliable and least offensive. Or rather, I did until halfway through writing this script, at which point the game started running 3 times as fast as it's supposed to. I tried turning off the PC, reinstalling and going through the same process, but nothing seemed to work other than returning to the CS-Fix solution. Then I went back to DG Voodoo and used a frame rate limiter, but this doesn't fully resolve the game's speed issues. Finally, I restarted the PC instead of turning it off and on, and it was fine again. The The joys of PC gaming, eh? Now, the illustrious DegGay apparently modified CSFix to make it compatible with his DG Voodoo wrapper, which some people report gives the best of both worlds, but I wasn't able to make this work myself. If you scroll through places like Abandonware forums or the Crimson Skies Discord servers, you'll get one post saying one thing worked perfectly for them, and the next post saying that didn't work and they had to use a different fix, and so on. So I can't say for sure there's a single easy and convenient fix for Crimson Skies on modern gaming machines. The best I can do is point you in the direction of the aforementioned solutions and wish you luck. Hypothetically, I suppose a Windows 98 emulator like PCEM could work, but considering Crimson Skies' minimum requirements, that's probably not a realistic option right now. A final point I should mention is that despite Crimson Skies being designed for flight sticks, the latest models may require third-party programs and extra tinkering to work with the game. Oh, and sim enthusiasts have also talked about how difficult it is to use a HOTAS setup with Crimson Skies. I don't know what that is, but I assume it's some weird sex thing. Anyway, all these problems could be solved with an updated release, ideally for GOG or something, but for some reason Microsoft don't seem to care very much about the original game. Maybe they feel that the more action-packed, accessible, and graphically impressive High Road to Revenge is a better representation of the franchise. So if you're interested in a Crimson Skies game and own any kind of Xbox, you could look into that. Regardless of whether you're willing to put the work into playing the original or gave up and tried the Xbox game, both titles are set in the same universe. That universe was many years in the making at FASA, involving hundreds of misspent lunch breaks and nighttime cram sessions on the part of enthusiastic staff. So let's close out the video with a look at the world of Crimson Skies, and one of the many thrilling adventures of the Fortune Hunters.
Right, let's get this clear, pirate. You are to surrender this fight and withdraw at once.
Yeah? On whose authority?
By the authority of His Majesty the King.
King George or King Kalaniano? And last time I checked a map, this was still Hawaiian waters.
In the early days of the 20th century, the United States of Crimson Skies looked very much like that of our own world. Though a prosperous and rapidly growing nation, it was still riven by old racial and religious enmities, labour strikes, and among the most desperate or disaffected, talk of sedition and secession. But domestic concerns had not kept Washington from taking an increasingly forceful role in international affairs. Buoyed by successful expeditions in the US Marine Corps in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, many felt that it was time the United States asserted itself on the world stage. With an undeclared tropical empire in Latin America, a navy almost worthy of its European rivals, and a growing appetite for military adventurism, the US was poised to become a world power. With the election of President Woodrow Wilson in 1913, the United States adopted a policy of liberal internationalism, and when the old order of Europe marched headlong into a catastrophic world war, Wilson avowed that America would not shy away from its responsibilities to the global order. Though initially playing the role of peacemaker and power broker, Wilson could not ignore repeated attacks by the German Navy, nor the Kaiser's attempt to strike a war pact with Mexico, and in 1917, the American Expeditionary Force was dispatched to Europe. Within a year, American soldiers would be fighting not only German and Austro-Hungarian troops on the Western Front, but also against the Bolsheviks in Russia. By the time the last of those men returned to America, it was not the same nation they had left behind. In the world of Crimson Skies, the travails that racked the United States in the wake of World War I were far more devastating than those of our history. A deadlier and more virulent outbreak of influenza triggered mass hysteria and drove states to impose ever more restrictive limitations on interstate travel and commerce. Federal infrastructure projects were abandoned, and there was a consolidation of power around state authorities. Overwhelmed by the ruinous cost of prosecuting the war and battling the Spanish flu, Washington found itself unable to pay the returning expeditionary force, and those that could not find work with state militias turned to rioting, vagrancy, or banditry. When Warren G. Harding campaigned for election in 1920, the most vigorous candidates did not speak merely of a return to normalcy, but of a radical regionalism that promoted isolationism in international affairs and greater independence for state governments. The most powerful and energetic political force in America looked inwards, not outwards, intent on reformation and the restoration of power to the states. When the issue of prohibition reached President Calvin Coolidge in 1923, the authority of the underfunded and ineffectual federal government had been much diminished, and it was left to individual states to decide whether to go wet or dry. State borders solidified, with armed checkpoints and National Guard patrols to either restrict the flow of alcohol entirely or assert control over its sale and taxation. For criminals, the profits that could be made from the illicit trade or seizure of alcohol were well worth the investment, and with borders locked down or too dangerous to cross by land, smugglers turned to planes as the favoured mode of transport. Local police, militias, criminals and vigilantes clashed over state lines, further damaging interstate relations and promoting a sense of regional individualism. Federal agencies shrank dramatically, their employees scattering to rival state authorities, and the power of governors and state legislatures increasingly outstripped that of Washington. In 1927, yet another virulent strain of influenza infected the nation, triggering another wave of panicked lockdowns and further militarization of state borders, thus making the aircraft an even more vital tool for lawbreakers of all sorts. When polling stations opened in 1928, many stayed home, fearful of this King's flu, or unimpressed by the failures of the federal authorities. The most motivated voters turned out in force for the regionalists, who simultaneously spoke of the achievements of local governments and the dangers of policies adopted by rival states. With the US government exposed as weak, incompetent, and outmoded, its remaining powers were gutted by the regionalists and returned to the states. And in 1929, the nation was struck two final, fatal blows. Utah declared Mormonism the official state religion, triggering a backlash and religious persecution in states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and Washington lacked the will or resources to intervene. When the stock market crashed in October of that year, the country was set aflame. Texas seceded in 1930, swiftly followed by California, the Carolinas, Utah, and New York. Within 3 years, the United States had disintegrated into dozens of independent powers. Some states merged or struck alliances along economic, military, religious, or racial lines. To the northeast, entities like the Empire State and the Atlantic Coalition emerged, whilst in the south, several states formed the Confederation of Dixie. Some looked to the Old World for their security, with Dixie seeking aid from the British Empire, and Louisiana becoming a virtual protectorate of the Third French Republic. In other regions, such as the Indian nations and the Kingdom of Hawaii, resurgent ethno-nationalist groups reclaimed power and broke away from the US entirely. To some, the collapse of the United States meant opportunity for ambitious and powerful men like Howard Hughes, who cemented his power base in the nation of Hollywood. To others, this chaos was the ultimate repudiation of both capitalism and corruption, and the Midwestern states rose from the darkness as the Christian Communist People's Nation. But in many areas, local authorities were unable to fully reassert control over their lands, and places like Free Colorado and the Appalachian Territories became havens for criminals, revolutionaries, and anyone else unwilling or unable to find a place in this new world. Many states quickly fell to squabbling with their rivals, leading to near-constant raiding and border incursions, or interstate uprising as factions attempted to break away or merge with their neighbours. With land routes imperiled by bandits and border wars, the nations looked to the skies as the new arteries of interstate commerce. From Pacifica to the Republic of Texas, great fleets of zeppelins ensured a steady stream of trade and travellers between the disunited states of America. But with the dawn of a new age came new dangers. For more than a decade, smugglers, deserters, and adrenaline junkies had been honing their skills as pilots, and the poorly defended airships were irresistible targets. Bands of sky pirates emerged to prey on these gaseous galleons, dueling air militias and private security in pursuit of their prize. Whereas on the ground, warfare was the domain of infantry, artillery, and armour, in the air, one skilled airman could make all the difference. Ace pilots became a new and privileged class of American society. Heroes like Paladin Blake of Blake Security, loyal showstopper Crawford of the Broadway Bombers, or Charlie Steele of the Hollywood Knights. But their enemies were equally famed for their daring and devious deeds. Some, like Bill Gravedigger Redman, led gangs feared across the states for their brutality and sadism. Others, like the mysterious Russian emigre the Black Swan, expected their crews to conduct themselves with professionalism and restraint, sparing civilians and giving quarter when asked. In 1937, the skies above the no longer United States are the new proverbial land of opportunity. Grit, determination, and fast reflexes can make anyone with a plane into the next Howard Hughes, but a single moment is all it takes to lose it to the next fella. Fortunes are won and lost in the blinking of an eye, and great air battles become the stuff of legend, at least until the next day's paper. And nobody knows these truths better than Nathan Zachary of the Fortune Hunters. To hear him tell it, Zachary's life has been one of incessant ups and downs, riding high on life one second and spat on by Lady Luck the next, but always at the centre of some momentous event in history, and usually on the side of the little guy. Zachary claims his career started when he volunteered to fly against Germany, learning the ropes from a Royal Air Force ace. After he was shot down by a better pilot, Zachary led a prison breakout from a POW camp and joined the Russians to fly biplanes on the Eastern Front. Then, when the Russian Empire was torn apart by civil war, Zachary reluctantly sided with the Bolsheviks, swayed by the oppression he had witnessed during his time there. But when the White Terror turned red, Zachary switched sides and helped Tsarists escape the clutches of the Cheka. When he returned to the United States, Zachary made his bones on Wall Street, earning a life of luxury and rubbing shoulders with Rockefeller and Ford. But Zachary soon became disgusted with what he'd become, seeing himself as no better than the same tyrants and tycoons he'd once opposed. When Wall Street crashed and the United States collapsed, he was exuberant. He watched the rise of air pirates and realized here was a life he had always wanted, a life of never-ending excitement and spitting in the eye of the old order. Zachary founded the Fortune Hunters gang, whose first big heist was the theft of the airship Fulcrum from the Empire State. Renaming the Zeppelin to the Pandora, Zachary and his crew earned themselves a reputation as some of the most skilled and daring air pirates in America. They also earned a name for themselves as Robin Hood figures, with Zachary himself nicknamed the Gentleman Pirate, as the Fortune Hunters never hurt civilians, and never steal from those who can't afford it, or don't deserve it. But like their illustrious leader, the Fortune Hunters lead a life of equal highs and lows. The most recent was a bungled raid on the Royal Air Zeppelin HMS Burlington in the skies above Cuba. Zachary put his trust in longtime friend Lucas Miles, who was to commandeer another Zeppelin and join the Pandora's attack. But at a crucial moment, Miles betrayed Zachary and turned his guns on the Fortune Hunters, hoping to wipe them out and steal the prize himself. The Fortune Hunters turned the tables on Miles and escaped the trap, but not before sending Miles and his flaming airship crashing into Cuba's waters. Wounded, low on supplies, and demoralized by the double-crossing Miles, the Fortune Hunters set their sights on their next heist. It wasn't long before Fortune smiled on them again, as the disaster in Cuba had provided a lead in a lucrative new opportunity, the location of the long-lost treasure of Sir Francis Drake. Allying with the Medusa gang, the Fortune Hunters head to Hawaii to claim the gold, but find themselves embroiled in the great game of the old powers, foiling an invasion of Hawaii by the British Empire. After a hard-fought victory, Zachary receives an unexpected transmission regarding an old friend from the Great War. Dr. Wilhelm Fassenbender was a genius inventor who, along with his daughter Ilsa, had been rescued by Zachary from a German prison camp, first joining the Bolsheviks and then fleeing to America. Many years later, it seems the Red Russians have further use for Fassenbender's inventions, as the Cheka send agents to kidnap him from the Boeing Special Projects Group. The Fortune Hunters launch a daring rescue operation, crippling the Soviet airship Workers' Voyage to liberate Fassenbender, taking down the Russian escorts and driving off the Black Swan gang, who were hunting the same quarry. They then turn back towards America to snatch Fassenbender's daughter and an experimental nitrous-assisted fighter from the Boeing Group. In the process, Zachary tangles with leading private security firm Blake Aviation, who are unable to prevent the pirates from getting away. Whilst in the area, Zachary takes the opportunity to steal fuel from the Soviets, and yet again embarrass the Blake Aviation forces sent to stop them. Incensed, Paladin Blake himself begins organising an attack on the Fortune Hunters, but the gang catch wind of his plans and discredit the firm further by raiding their airfield, destroying a military Zeppelin and shooting down Paladin Blake in an air duel. This string of humiliating defeats for Blake Aviation severely damages their reputation, and many clients drop the firm in favour of the up-and-coming Empire State-based Sacred Trust initiative. Sacred Trust appeared out of obscurity to become a major power player in the private security industry, inexplicably well-funded, well-connected, and fielding experienced pilots flying the latest Focke-Wulf designs out of Europe. But they're not the only new player to make their mark on the Americas. The Black Hats are a particularly noxious new gang with little use for the pirates' code, or any sort of ethical boundaries in general. The gang come to the attention of the Fortune Hunters when they shoot down the Workers' Voyage and attack a hospital ship sent to rescue the survivors. Zachary and his crew drive them off in the nick of time, inadvertently shaming Blake Aviation even further. The Pandora heads on to the nation of Hollywood, where the crew hatch a plan to rescue starlet Lana Cooper from sleazy executive Johnny Johnson, an old enemy of Zachary's. Besting Johnson, the Hollywood Knights, and Hughes Aviation, the Fortune Hunters inflict one final blow to Paladin Blake when they hijack the Zeppelin Figaro, destroy the Blake Aviation fighters protecting it, and flee to free Colorado. With Blake's reputation at an all-time low and the Fortune Hunters home free, it seems a long-deserved vacation is on the cards. But when Zachary and his crew arrive at the pirate haven of the Rocky Mountains, they stumble headfirst into an intercontinental conspiracy that could spell doom for Nathan Zachary, the Fortune Hunters, and all the independent states of America. The most obvious inspiration for Crimson Sky's story was Australian-American actor Errol Flynn, both in image and reality. Flynn's swashbuckling interwar adventure movies like Captain Blood and Robin Hood clearly made their mark on FASA, but I suspect Flynn's real-life adventures were not unknown to his creators. Zachary's account of his time in Europe and Tsarist Russia, for example, mirrors the idealistic and foolish romanticism of Flynn's involvement in the Spanish Civil War and the Cuban Revolution. And Zachary's dashing, larger-than-life character and incorrigible womanizing could just as easily be based on Flynn's characters or his real-life reputation. More controversial allegations hurled at Flynn, that he was a rapist, a closeted homosexual, or a Nazi spy, don't appear to have influenced Crimson Skies, though do pop up in other media based on Flynn and his work. No, Nathan Zachary is a relatively uncontroversial character, or at least was at the time, a scoundrel with a heart of gold and a taste for excitement and beautiful women. That said, there are flashes of something more, or perhaps less, to Zachary's character. There are a couple of points at which he drops the pantomime swagger and becomes murderously serious. Not over questions of morality, but rather when anyone, even his own crew, imply they've seen past the Errol Flynn act.
What I'm getting at, sir, is that it's been a tough month. We all know how sore you are about that rat Miles double-crossing us in Cuba, but he's sleeping with the fishes now, and you'll figure out some plan to make us all rich again. You always do.
Tex, let's not ever talk about Lucas Miles again. Understood? Now I've got work to do.
I'm not sure if this was part of the script or a conscious decision by the VA, but Zachary seems considerably more upset about these incidents than he does slave labour or mass murder. The latter certainly affect him and his decision-making, but don't provoke such a visceral reaction.
Is it true you once shot down one of your own pilots for strafing innocent bystanders?
I said you talk too much, Blake!
It's a facet to his character that I'd forgotten until I replayed the campaign. Maybe Nathan Zachary isn't so much the Robin Hood figure he purports to be, but a deeply insecure, impulsive, and self-destructive one who has more in common with low-life raiders than he's willing to admit. At one point in the story, Zachary is given the chance to give up a life of piracy and make an honest living, which he promptly rejects. On its face, the scene is just another example of Zachary's roguishness and disdain of pompous and hypocritical authority figures, but it could also be seen as a comment on his cowardice, not in the conventional sense, but in fleeing an ordered and responsible life in favour of empty hedonism. Is Zachary a deconstruction of the classic serial hero? Probably not. This could just be overanalyzing on my part, and even if it is intentional, it's certainly not a major part of the story. Zachary is mostly just part figurehead, part cipher for the player. He's a likeable lead and an easy role model for those of us who wish we could lose ourselves in the life of a dashing air pirate, a leading man in a 30s adventure movie. But if you believe the real-life rumours, said stars tended not to appreciate sharing the limelight, so it's probably appropriate that the rest of the Crimson Skies cast are a little underdeveloped and underexposed. There are probably 3 characters at most that someone who played Crimson Skies at release would remember with much clarity today: Nathan Zachary, and trailing him the Black Swan and Paladin Blake. The rest are a bit harder to recall, maybe Lana Cooper, or is that Lana Turner, plus the Fassenbenders and a couple of the major antagonists. The others are a bit of a blur to me, even having just replayed the game. Which one was Ulysses Booth and which one was Ace Dixon? Who was that broad with the Medusas? What were the names of the other fortune hunters? I know there was a witch at some point. There are a couple of reasons the rest of the cast don't stick in the mind so well. One is that in classic serial fashion, the story of each region, or heist if you like, is fairly self-contained, with many characters and factions appearing only in that one story arc. One or two, like Paladin Blake, are part of the main plot, but the others might only be there for a few missions and then vanish from the campaign entirely. In some cases, these characters stay on with the crew, but are basically ignored from that point onwards, as is the case with the Fassenbenders. Another reason they can be hard to remember is that though the game is heavily story-driven, it's delivered primarily through radio transmissions. If you're lucky, a major cutscene might show a photo or clip of the character a few times, but for the most part they get very little screen time, emphasis on the screen. Because some of the characters don't have much to distinguish them from each other, it can be hard to follow who's who. The Pandora crew, for instance, actually have a substantial amount of dialogue throughout the game, but I couldn't remember a single name and I kept mixing them up. None of them have any character development, but then neither really does Zachary himself. It seems like the game is setting something like this up at the beginning, but it doesn't materialize. I suppose it's natural that Zachary and everyone else in the story feel like reusable assets. Much like the stars of many serials, they could be recycled anew every episode or every season, without significant changes to the character's essential features. But this obviously limits what can be done with that character, and besides, the ideal with the serials was that these characters themselves had some memorable or easily recognizable catchphrase or character traits.
When you hit the ground, tell him Nathan Zachary sent you!
That arguably works fine with Zachary, Blake, or the Black Swan, who talk and act in a way that's sufficiently outlandish and instantly recognizable to us. Keep in mind the latter two were already figureheads of the Crimson Skies franchise. Blake, for example, has in-universe comics and serials based off his life. The Pandora crew and most of the rest of the cast aren't like that. They might have some sort of gimmick, like Ace Dixon complaining about how he keeps getting shot down, but it's not jazzy enough to make them stand out enough. I have a vague memory of one of the fortune hunters being spunky but inexperienced, and another liking to blow things up, but I don't recall which was which. We're just following or perhaps playing the role of daredevil hero Nathan Zachary, and everything and everyone else in the story just orbits around this reassuring feel-good fantasy. But whilst Crimson Skies is certainly a fantasy, I would quibble with some other reviewers who argued that this is just as true of the original setting. In-game, the violence in Crimson Skies is very family-friendly. Despite references in the manual to pilots jumping into their own propellers or brief mentions of murder and molesting of innocents, the mayhem and destruction of Crimson Skies is almost always played as light entertainment. Outside of newspaper clippings, there are maybe 2 or 3 instances in the entire campaign where a specific character is stated to have been outright killed. The rest of the time, people rarely seem in any real danger. If Crimson Skies followed the rules of real-life aviation disasters, the fortune hunters would have a death toll in the thousands as a result of all the airplanes and airships they'd shot down over the course of the campaign. Instead, every pilot somehow manages to hit the silk just in the nick of time, and crashing their plane will merely result in an extended stay in the hospital. This is as important to the plausibility of the story as it is keeping things from getting too heavy. Characters in Crimson Skies frequently flip from allies to enemies, and Zachary might be downing an enemy ace in one mission and then bedding them a few missions later, or vice versa. This sort of thing only works if aerial combat is closer to an extreme sport than a true matter of life and death, where being shot down is an embarrassing inconvenience at worst. The whole thing works on 1930s movie logic, and it absolutely has to, because a lot of the setting wouldn't make much sense otherwise. All the same, I think there's still some daylight between the world depicted in the rulebook and that shown in the PC game. I was watching another review by a channel called Gaming HD, who noticed that the 1930s America of Crimson Skies seemed remarkably progressive compared to its real-world counterpart, with no mention of racial tensions and an unusually high number of female pilots. Whilst that's mostly accurate, there's a dialogue involving one of the Pandora crew and the topic of forced labour camps that suggests otherwise. I think this is stronger in the game due to the specific kind of story it's telling. The original Crimson Skies rulebook does feature female pilots, but it's still presented in a way as to suggest this is out of the norm, and the language implies pirate gangs or militias that completely ignore blood or sex in their selection of pilots is an exception rather than the rule. The rulebook is also much more open in discussing characters' religious or socio-political motivations, as well as describing incidents of cold-blooded murder. The section on Dixie Ace Colonel Rapier Travis probably best sums up the general tone of the original Crimson Skies, explicitly stating that Travis' personal unit, the Winged Knights, were originally an all-white squadron that the Colonel reformed into a merit-based outfit. That section tells you essentially everything you need to know about how Crimson Skies presented itself. A universe that was born out of the 1930s and the social attitudes that entailed, but massaged somewhat to make it less unpleasant to contemporary audiences. Obviously, that's not to imply the rulebook was adding female pilots, for example, simply for the sake of making the setting palatable. Characters like the Black Swan, Charlie Steele and such were modelled on exceptional high-profile figures from the period like Amelia Earhart, Hilda Hewitt, Bessie Coleman and the like. But I don't think that's the reason there are so many female pilots in the PC game. I think the reason for that is much more straightforward. It's because the PC game is offering a power fantasy, not laying out background lore to the setting. The specific story, the specific experience that the PC game offers is, as Jordan Weissman himself put it, being a stud, and I'm sure that was meant in all senses of the word. The game is about Nathan Zachary and his adventures, both aeronautical and amorous, and the female characters in Crimson Skies are mostly there for him to flirt with. I'm not denying there was probably some pressure from Microsoft to lessen the adult elements of the Crimson Skies universe, but I imagine the number one factor was simply that this was a Nathan Zachary story where you do Nathan Zachary things, which means light-hearted adventure and a succession of delectable but dangerous broads. In the unlikely event the PC game had revolved around one of the nastier air pirates, or set in a more controversial area of the setting like the New Confederacy or the People's Nation, then I'm sure the world would have come across very differently. So that's why I was quite surprised when I heard the phrase Uncle Adolf mentioned in an early mission, then Imperial Japan soon after. Before replaying, I'd misremembered Crimson Skies' alternate history as involving a more resilient German Empire and no mention of the Far East, but it actually takes place in a world where European history didn't deviate too much from reality. It's not that I dislike media featuring the Nazis or that sort of thing, it's that it felt strange to me to combine them with a fantastical depiction of 1930s America. When I think of Hollywood's golden age, that picture doesn't include fascism. But this comes back to the point I brought up earlier about historical overlap and depicting an era through the lens of art and media. Events moved fast in the interwar period, and so did pop culture. There's no objective reason not to feature both Howard Hughes and Hermann Goering in the same story, nor Lana Turner and the Luftwaffe. And there's no good reason serials or comic strips shouldn't combine pulp fiction with the future Axis powers. The 1940s were the era of propaganda shorts, of the Looney Tunes launching commando raids into Europe, and comic book heroes socking Hitler or exposing Japanese spies. The earliest comic book depictions of American heroes fighting against Germany came before the US had even formally entered the war. But the reality of the situation is irrelevant. As Fasser saw it, the 1930s were the last truly romantic era, an era when realistic villains were mostly Depression-era figures like gangsters, greedy landlords, or crooked politicians. In later serials and comic books, Nazi agents and collaborators are often depicted as foils for American heroes of the era, but to my knowledge this is an anachronism, and aside from material set during World War I, representatives of the German state were not really utilised as antagonists in these mediums prior to 1940. Now, for many Americans, the 30s were obviously not so romantic, and one could certainly cite the conflict between Huey Long and Franklin D. Roosevelt as justification for darker or more contentious elements. But the prevailing fantasy of the era, to contemporary eyes, was what we talked about earlier in the video: swing music, starlets, serial adventures, aerobatics, and all the rest. So it was very strange to me personally to be thinking of sky pirates and glamorous celebrities, only to have the dream punctured by mention of geopolitical maneuvering in expectation of World War II. And to be clear, that's the last time it's mentioned in the game if I recall correctly. Imperial ambitions certainly come up again, just not in that specific context. Maybe this was deliberate on Fasser's part, to enhance the romanticism of the fantasy 30s by portraying it as the twilight before a second storm of steel. It just doesn't work for me though, it slightly upsets the setting rather than further glamorize it. It's illogical, of course, to complain about mention of Nazis in a game set in 1937, the same year a swastika-emblazoned Hindenburg was touring the US, but then not quibble with the appearance of a Hercules or other anachronistic elements. In fact, it would be entirely possible to set a game like Crimson Skies in the 1940s, and still utilize a great deal of the same material whilst including Nazis and Wunderwaffen and all the usual things that come with all that. High Road to Revenge is to some extent a halfway point to this. But I do feel that an American interwar setting and an American interwar setting featuring Nazis are two different and very distinct settings, and I think the romanticism of Crimson Skies works better when set in the former. I suppose it raises further questions about what else fits with the setting. How much of other cultures or other countries could be blended with Hollywood and hues before the Crimson Skies universe becomes too diluted? Action adventures of Errol Flynn's day featured Singapore, Cairo, Istanbul, the Congo, and other exotic stages, and one could conceivably set a fantastical 30s aviation flyer in the skies above war-torn China or betwixt the pyramids of Egypt. High Road to Revenge takes something approximating this approach, but I think it undermines the America-centrism of the universe, and I suspect Hawaii is the farthest the setting can go before it starts to feel stretched. On the subject, I'm curious in this context of period appropriateness how FASA would have portrayed Europe in the earlier pre-board game version of Crimson Skies we covered at the start of the video. I don't think Wiseman has gone into much detail about it other than the time period, the Knights of the Air concept, and the fictional island setting. I'm assuming it would have been somewhat similar to the faux feudalism of air power, but with a stronger piratical bent. If the core fantasy of Crimson Skies drew from the golden age of Hollywood and American aviation, what would the prevailing cultural attraction of interwar Europe be? From what I understand, Wiseman and McCoy had already been thinking of Hughes and Earhart in the original Virtual Worlds incarnation of the concept, making me wonder whether the writers and artists at FASA would have had as much enthusiasm for anything but the American fantasy of Errol Flynn in a warplane, swooping down to rescue a beautiful dame. So I'm glad it was a not-so-dirty 30s America that FASA settled on, as it seems to have been the time and place the teams on both the board game and the PC title were most motivated to bring to life. It's a wonderful setting that provided a unique and memorable backstory, enchanting aesthetics, and a damn fine dogfighting game, and I hope that one day we see more stories in this universe.
Looks like I picked a good time to go out for some air. Eh, darling?
Boy, are you a sight for sore eyes. Give me a hand with these mugs.
I don't know. Maybe I should go back and guard the Zeppelin.
I knew I should have stayed in my bunk this morning.
It seems unlikely flight simulators will ever truly die out. No matter how small the market becomes, there'll always be a hardcore niche of players willing to shell out a lot of money for the most authentic experience they can afford. Joysticks, multi-monitor setups, pedals, VR headsets, and most importantly, a cool flight jacket to wear over their pajamas. But their popularity in the wider market comes in fits and starts, with one or two arcade-style games achieving some mainstream success, but never quite managing to keep the whole genre afloat. On the PC, even games like Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, the X-Wing series, Star Lancer, Crimson Skies, and others just can't give dogfighting the same permanence as first-person shooters. Considering the success of the recent Top Gun sequel, there'll probably be a small resurgence in interest in modern combat sims like the Ace Combat series, but I don't see it lasting. Historically, it never has. The genre has always grappled with the negative connotations of being a sim title, and perhaps also that it will appeal to few outside of military history enthusiasts. Crimson Skies tried to shoot down that stereotype, in part by fleeing the label of flight sim, but also in embracing the historical overtures of vintage fighter planes by packaging them with a sweetened and romanticized history. The latter, at least, was a solid concept, to turn negative perceptions on their head and make the historical elements a strength rather than a weakness. Maybe it didn't quite have the success Microsoft were hoping for, but it certainly worked for me. Back in 2000, I was definitely one of those people who would usually turn their nose up at flight sims and old warplanes, but Crimson Skies somehow caught my attention and I immediately fell in love with it. We mentioned a few of the ideas FASA Studio experimented with in the sequel, like an interactive movie structure and open world elements. The former sounds like an awful idea to me, and I honestly don't understand why anyone thought it would fit a dogfighting game, or any game quite frankly. Maybe they really wanted to push a branching story structure or something. I didn't really look into it too much for this video. The open world or hub-based idea is, I think, perfectly compatible with Crimson Skies, and could perhaps be combined with the lighter fleet management or customization features included in other arcade flight sims. And though the Crimson Skies universe was always built around the fantasy of being an ace pilot, I think there are other concepts that could work in the setting, like maybe a high fleet style game where you manage a zeppelin and pirate crew or air militia, or perhaps a more story-driven version of this in the vein of Larian's Dragon Commander. It can be disheartening to see news stories dating all the way back to 2008 about how Jordan Weisman is trying to bring the Crimson Skies franchise back, yet nothing seems to ever come of it. Weisman released a mobile game called Crimson Steam Pirates in 2011, which shared many similarities with the tone and style of the Crimson Skies world, so maybe that was a low-cost experiment in testing the waters or something. In a Retro Gamer article, he also stated he was working on an RPG in a Crimson Skies adjacent world, though this seems to have turned out to be the recently announced Lamplighters League. I was browsing the Crimson Skies Reddit for any updated news on the state of the franchise, and some users claim to have spoken to Weisman at conventions as recently as 2022, adding that he affirmed he's still trying to bring the series back. It happened with Shadowrun, and it happened with MechWarrior, so my fingers are crossed for Crimson Skies. As I mentioned before, if you need help finding and running the original game, look around on the Crimson Skies subreddit or Discord servers, and you'll find several tutorials that will hopefully solve any issues you have. Again, I really wish we'd just get an updated release on Good Old Games or something, but it does seem like a good portion of those who pine for more Crimson Skies were actually those that played the Xbox game. I won't be covering High Road to Revenge on this channel, as whilst I'd like to play it, I can't be bothered to get another Xbox, and there's no way I'm going the cloud gaming route. If the situation changes and it gets a PC port, then I'll probably reconsider though. If you're interested in watching a Let's Play of Crimson Skies or High Road to Revenge, there are a few on YouTube, but I wanted to highlight the one done by the channel Research Indicates. This LP is actually unfinished, at least on YouTube, but from the few clips I watched, it seems to go really in depth into not only the lore, but the real-life technology associated with Crimson Skies, with little features on the background of zeppelins and prototype fighters, and visits to some historical sites. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on Crimson Skies, especially if it helped spur further interest in some of the movies, radio serials, and aviation history that inspired the setting. Sadly, there's no definitive spiritual successor to Crimson Skies that I'm aware of. You'll see people advertising their Kickstarter projects or mods for Microsoft Flight Simulator and the like, but I don't think there's any one game that has become the uncontested favourite for old fans. I've mentioned many of the older titles that influenced Crimson Skies, from Luftwaffe to Red Baron to X-Wing, and you can find most of these on GOG. In terms of contemporary games that include that specific era of aviation, arcade combat sims like the online titles War Thunder or World of Warplanes seem to be quite popular, or for a more traditional single-player experience, try the more recent entry in the Il-2 Sturmovik series. If you're a combat sim fan and you have other recommendations for people who already played or want something vaguely similar to Crimson Skies, feel free to drop some suggestions in the comments. But that about wraps up today's video. The next retrospective will be on Worlds of Ultima: The Savage Empire, a spin-off title from the mainline Ultima series that, like Crimson Skies, is a tribute to classic media from a bygone era. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me instead of doing something productive, and thanks again to my long-time subscribers. Bye for now.